It was 8:15 AM on May the 5th, 1961, and astronaut Alan Bartlett Shepard Jr. was facing an unexpected crisis. Chosen to be the first American and the second human in history to blast into space, at 5:15 AM, Shepard had been strapped into his Mercury spacecraft Freedom 7, and the hatch bolted shut behind him. Liftoff was scheduled for 7:20 AM, but a series of delays caused by cloud cover over Cape Canaveral and various technical glitches resulted in Shepard sitting atop his Redstone rocket for over 3 hours. Soon, an unwelcome feeling began to creep over Shepard's body, growing worse and worse with every passing minute. At first he tried to ignore it, but eventually the feeling became so unbearable Shepard was forced to radio his Capsule Commander, or CapCom, that he had to urinate. Badly. Mission Control was stunned. No one had even considered how Shepard was supposed to answer the call of nature. After all, his suborbital mission was only supposed to last 15 minutes. It was a problem which has plagued astronauts ever since, prompting engineers to develop a variety of weird, wonderful, and sometimes pretty disgusting solutions. This is the story of how astronauts boldly go when no one has gone before. Prior to the space race, little thought was given to how future astronauts would relieve themselves during missions. The first system for collecting urine during long flights was developed in 1955 for pilots of the Lockheed U-2 spy plane who, flying at altitudes in excess of 21,000 meters, had to wear partial pressure suits in order to survive. The system took the form of an indwelling catheter, a small plastic tube threaded up the pilot's urethra into their bladder, which automatically siphoned urine through a hose into a collection bag. As you can imagine, this system was extremely uncomfortable and decidedly less than popular with the pilots. It also ran the risk of irritating or damaging the urethra walls and causing urinary tract infections. Later, an external system was developed that used a condom-like latex sleeve that rolled over the pilot's penis, but while significantly more comfortable than the catheter, this urine collection device, or UCD, was not without its problems. Indeed, in a 2010 survey of U-2 pilots based at Beale Air Force Base in California, 60% of respondents reported problems with their UCDs, including poor fit, leakage, and skin irritation from prolonged contact with urine. Furthermore, due to the extreme secrecy within the CIA, which operated the U-2, external UCD technology was not shared with NASA. And while in 1957 a group of British investors patented a similar device for use with pressure suits or equipment whose position or body harness makes normal urination highly inconvenient or impossible, which diverted urine into a bag of absorbent material, this design does not appear to have reached NASA planners either. Following the launch of Project Mercury, the first American manned space program, in 1958, the United States Air Force sponsored a study on human waste collection in a spacecraft. For the short-duration Mercury missions then being planned, fecal collection was not deemed necessary, though urine collection would likely be required. The study examined contemporary urine collection devices then on the market and concluded that the designs in use aboard military aircraft were inadequate due to excessive leakage, a problem that would only be exacerbated by microgravity. Instead, the final report recommended the use of commercial UCDs used in hospitals on bedridden male patients, which formed a tight seal around the penis and featured a one-way valve to prevent backflow. Strangely, however, NASA seemingly ignored this and similar studies, and both the original Mercury 7 astronauts' training and the testing of the Mercury spacecraft and the Navy Mark IV spacesuit were conducted entirely without any form of UCD. Indeed, when a 12-year-old Pennsylvania schoolgirl wrote to NASA in 1961 to ask, "Dear Sir, in our science class we were talking about the first man that would go into space. We would like to know where they go to the toilet when they're up in space and there's no gravity. Yours truly, Brenda Kemmerer." Dr. Freeman H. Quimby of NASA's Office of Life Science Programs replied that, quote, "The first spaceman is not expected to have to go. As the first space flights would only last 15 minutes, astronauts were simply expected to hold it until brought aboard the recovery ship after splashdown." And that brings us back to the morning of the 5th of May 1961 and Alan Shepard's awkward pre-flight dilemma. While NASA records indicate that a urine collection container was installed near the capsule's entrance hatch, this would have been impossible for Shepard to use, being firmly strapped into his form-fitting flight couch. And letting Shepard out to use the regular facilities would have required the pad crew to laboriously unfasten the 70 bolts holding the hatch shut, further delaying the launch. Unable to resist the urge any longer, Shepard requested permission to urinate in his spacesuit. At first, Mission Control refused, fearing that the urine would short out the biosensors monitoring Shepard's vital signs. But when Shepard suggested they simply switch the sensors off, they relented, and a very relieved Shepard proceeded to, well, relieve himself. Due to Shepard's supine legs-up position, the urine pooled in the small of his back and soaked into his one-piece wool undergarment, where the cool, pure oxygen flowing through the spacesuit quickly dried it out. The crisis averted, the countdown resumed, and at 9:34 a.m., Shepard blasted off into the wild blue yonder, reaching an altitude of 187.5 kilometers before re-entering the atmosphere and splashing down at the Atlantic Ocean 487 kilometers east of Cape Canaveral. Though less impressive than Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin's historic orbit of the Earth less than a month before, the flight of Mercury Redstone 7 finally put the United States firmly in the space race, and for more on the, shall we say, less than stellar early days of the US space program, please do check out our previous video, Kaputnik, America's largely forgotten disastrous first attempt to launch a satellite. Alan Shepard's embarrassing experience as an incontinent ballistic missile prompted NASA to pursue a practical UCD design in time for the next Mercury mission, the July 21st, 1961 Redstone Mercury 4 flight of astronaut Virgil Gus Grissom. A popular legend holds that Dolores B.D. O'Hara nursed the Mercury 7 astronauts cobbled together the first UCD on the eve of Grissom's flight using a condom and a woman's girdle. In reality, Grissom wore 2 pairs of rubber incontinence pants such that urine would collect between the 2 layers. It was also denied his morning coffee, a known diuretic. In the event, Grissom never ended up needing to relieve himself, which is perhaps unsurprising given the sphincter-tightening turn his mission took shortly after splashdown. And for more on how America's second astronaut was nearly lost at sea, please do check out our previous video, Forgotten History, NASA and the Sinking Spacecraft. Now, meanwhile, NASA assigned James McBarron to oversee efforts at BF Goodrich, the company that produced the Mercury astronauts' Navy Mark IV spacesuits, to develop a standardized UCD for subsequent spaceflights. The company was unable to procure a satisfactorily leak-proof system, leading McBarron, along with Al Rochford and Joe Schmidt of NASA's Manned Spaceflight Center Suit Laboratory, to tackle the problem themselves. McBarron purchased condoms from various commercial manufacturers and tested them for fit and durability until he found the ideal brand, then worked with that manufacturer to develop the finalized urine collection sleeve. The final UCD consisted of an elasticized belt worn beneath the astronaut's spacesuit, to which was attached the latex sleeve, a short rubber hose, a one-way valve to prevent flow reversal, a clamp to seal off the system after splashdown, and a flat polyethylene collection bag. The whole assembly was held in place by a set of tight-fitting undergarments. Another popular myth associated with the early American space program is that NASA had to change the size classifications on its UCDs in order to accommodate the astronauts' legendary egos. This story seems to have originated with engineer Donald Rattake, nicknamed Dr. Flush, due to his extensive work on astronaut waste collection systems, who stated in the 2008 Science Channel documentary Moon Machines, quote, "Inside the urine collection assembly, which we call the pee pouch, is a 1-liter bag. And the attachment to the body was a condom with a hose on the end of it which allowed the urine to flow freely into the bag. The condoms initially came in 3 different sizes, small, medium, and large. But few astronauts, whatever their real dimensions, refused to accept any that were anything but large. We changed the names to large, gigantic, and humongous." Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins repeated this anecdote in his 1974 autobiography, Carrying the Fire, An Astronaut's Journeys, writing that, quote, "Then it's time to don a triangular yellow plastic urine bag by inserting the penis into a rubbery receiver built into one corner of it. There are 3 sizes of receivers, small, medium, and large, which are always referred to in more heroic terms. Extra large, immense, and unbelievable." In reality, this God, it's so good. In reality, this sizing system seems to have been merely an informal joke among the astronauts rather than a psychological trick played by NASA. Indeed, whatever their preconceptions and insecurities, the astronauts quickly learned from experience what size of sleeve to use. As Apollo 9 astronaut Russell Rusty Schweikart later recalled, "There's always the possibility that in maneuvering around in a suit you end up pulling off the condom. And there's always, we have 3 sizes, small, medium, large in diameter, and there's always this little ego thing about which one you do pick. Of course, the smart guy picks the right size because it's very important. But what happens is, if you get too small a size, it effectively pinches off the flow and you just turn yellow because you can't go. And if, on the other hand, you've got an ego problem and you decide on a large when you should have a medium, what happens is you take your first leak and you end up with half of the urine outside the bag on you. And that's the last time you make that mistake. So it's a cute little trick there." Whatever the case, McBarron's UCD was first used during the February 20th, 1962 Mercury Atlas 6 mission, during which astronaut John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. Over the course of his 3 orbits, Glenn used his UCD once, depositing 756 milliliters of urine into the collection bag. Remarkably, this is over 30% greater than the capacity of the average male bladder, a result of the strange effects of microgravity on human physiology. Normally, gravity pulls urine towards the bottom of the bladder, bladder, causing the walls to gradually expand. When the bladder is approximately 2/3 full, nerves begin to register this expansion and signal to the body that it's time to urinate. In microgravity, however, urine tends to collect in a sphere and does not begin to press the walls until the bladder is already far beyond its regular capacity. While overshadowed by his other achievements, in his own modest way, John Glenn's orbital whiz was a milestone in space systems engineering, which is probably why his UCD has been on public display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. since 1970. Though sometimes prone to leakage, if improperly sized or fitted, James McBaron's UCD design became the NASA standard throughout the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs. During flights to and from the moon, Apollo astronauts could connect their UCDs via a hose to a urine transfer system, or UTS, which collected the urine in an onboard tank. Most of the urine was then vented overboard, but some of it was retained for analysis by flight surgeons after the mission. And when the astronauts were working on the lunar surface, the urine drained into a polyethylene bag worn under their spacesuits. Amusingly, while only second to step off the lunar module, Apollo 11 astronaut Edwin Buzz Aldrin did achieve a space first of his own, becoming the first person to relieve themselves on the lunar surface. This act, performed just before Aldrin stepped off the lunar module ladder, remains a minor source of pride for the astronaut, with Aldrin later stating, "Everyone has their firsts on the moon, and that one hasn't been disputed by anybody." Unfortunately, however, the experience was somewhat less tidy than Aldrin might have hoped. Mission Commander Neil Armstrong's landing was so soft that the lunar module's legs didn't compress as much as expected, so when Aldrin jumped off the ladder onto the lunar surface, he fell further than anticipated, and the resulting jolt damaged his UCD, causing urine to collect not in the proper bag, but rather in one of Aldrin's spacesuit boots. That's right, throughout the mission's historic 2-hour and 31-minute lunar EVA, Buzz Aldrin was walking around with urine sloshing around in his boot. We've all been there, Buzz. The UCD remained in use into the early Space Shuttle program, when it was replaced by the Disposable Absorbent Containment Trunk, or DACT, effectively an advanced set of adult diapers. The DACT was developed in response to NASA's 1978 opening of the astronaut corps to female candidates whose anatomy was incompatible with the original UCD. They were first flown to space on April 4th, 1983 by the all-male crew of STS-6, the first mission of the Space Shuttle Challenger, while 2 months later, on June 18th, they were worn by the United States' first female astronaut, Sally Ride, during the STS-7 mission. However, NASA quickly realized that the custom-fabricated DACTs were not economical and that it would be far more cost-effective to purchase commercially off-the-shelf adult diapers. Known as maximum absorbency garments, or MAGs, these units replaced the DACTs starting in 1988 and contain enough sodium polyacrylate material to absorb 2 liters of urine or other bodily fluids. They are still worn by American astronauts under their launch entry suits during liftoff and re-entry, and under their extravehicular mobility units, or EMUs, during extravehicular activities or spacewalks. And for more about the surprising engineering challenges of working out in the hostile vacuum of space, please do check out our previous video, Touching the Void, the story of the space jetpack. Now, at this point in the video, you've likely noticed that we've left out an important part of the waste disposal equation, namely, having a shit. Even more than urine collection, early NASA planners and engineers were loath even to consider the problem of solid waste management and simply chose to sidestep the issue entirely. After all, early Mercury missions weren't supposed to last more than a day, and for more on the incredible badassery of the last and longest Mercury mission, please do check out our previous video. I'll do it myself, the greatest feat of piloting in space. However, in order to avoid accidents in the days leading up to a mission, astronauts were fed a low-residue diet, high in protein and low in fiber, for example, steak and eggs, which has since become the traditional pre-flight breakfast for American astronauts. This diet also minimizes the production of intestinal gases, which in the reduced atmospheric pressures of spacecraft can expand and produce severe pain. Even today, Russian cosmonauts follow a similar practice. Though the Soyuz spacecraft typically takes only a few hours to reach the International Space Station, depending on orbital maneuvers, crews can sometimes spend several days in orbit before docking. And while the Soyuz does feature a rudimentary space toilet, more on that a bit later, cosmonauts don't like to use it and will often combine their low-residue diet with a pre-flight enema to completely clean out their bowels. But while this strategy worked well enough for Mercury, as NASA transitioned over to the long-duration Gemini and Apollo flights, the problem of collecting number 2s could no longer be ignored. But the solution they came up with, the Fecal Collection Assembly, or FCA, would prove to be one of the most reviled pieces of hardware in the history of spaceflight. Manufactured by the Whirlpool Corporation, the FCA consisted of a small clear plastic bag with an adhesive gasket intended to seal the opening to the astronaut's bare buttocks. Ordinarily, back on Earth, bowel movements are separated from the anus by good old gravity, but in the microgravity of space, that doesn't happen. The FCA thus featured a small pouch or cot in its sidewall into which the astronaut could insert their finger to help dislodge stubborn turds. Lovely. Once the deed was done, the FCA came packaged with sheets of toilet wipes and wet wipes with which the astronaut could clean themselves, which were disposed of inside the bag along with the astronaut's leavings. But if this whole process already sounds completely undignified, especially if performed in front of others in the crammed confines of a spacecraft, brace yourself because it gets worse. Unlike urine, there was no mechanism to jettison the filled FCAs, which instead had to be stored on board. But without further treatment, the bacteria-riddled droppings would quickly ferment and produce gases like methane, causing the bags to inflate and possibly burst, resulting in the most literal manifestation of the expression, the shit hitting the fan. Each FCA thus came packaged with a packet of germicidal liquid, which the astronaut was supposed to insert into the bag before sealing it. They would burst the packet by squeezing it, then thoroughly knead the germicide into the boop to ensure that all of the gas-generating bacteria were killed. As you can imagine, astronauts hated using the FCAs and tried to avoid defecation by any means possible, such as simply holding it in or eating only half of their assigned meals. And to learn more about how astronauts stay properly fed and hydrated in space, please do check out our previous video, What's Up with Space Food. And you really can't blame them. As NASA's own official history states, the fecal collection system presented an even more distasteful set of problems. The collection process required a great deal of skill to preclude escape of feces from the collection bag and consequent soiling of the crew, their clothing, or cabin surfaces. The fecal collection process was, moreover, extremely time-consuming because of the level of difficulty involved with use of the system. An Apollo 7 astronaut estimated the time required to correctly accomplish the process at 45 minutes. Good placement of fecal bags was difficult to attain. This was further complicated by the fact that the flap at the back of the constant wear garment created an opening that was too small for easy placement of the bags. Furthermore, improper use of the FCA could lead to disgusting situations, as the crew of Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal for the Apollo 11 lunar landing, discovered in May 1969.
What's happening?
Oh, who did it?
Who did what?
Who did it? Give me some.
Where did that come from?
Give me a napkin quick. There's a turd floating loose.
I didn't do it. It ain't one of mine. I don't think it's one of mine.
Mine was a little more sticky than that. Oh, anyway.
God almighty. Hey, tell us that. Here's another goddamn turd. What's the matter with you guys? Here, give me a... Well, Dave, if it was me, I'm sure you'd know I was on the floor.
Was it just floating around?
Yeah.
Mine was stickier than that.
Mine was too. It hit this
When
bag.
I stuck my
right
finger in it, mine was nice and soft.
God dang.
I don't know who that is. I can neither claim it nor disclaim it.
What the hell is going on here?
I don't know.
Now, just who was responsible for this close encounter of the turd kind remains a mystery to this day, although we did do a deep dive investigation on it and our theory of who did it in our video To Boldly Go Where No Fecal Matter Has Gone Before. You can watch it after this video if you fancy it. And even if waste remains safely inside the bags, with space inside the Gemini and Apollo capsules at a premium, finding storage for used bags and other trash quickly became a challenge. This lack of adequate waste disposal led Gemini 5 astronauts Leroy Gordon Cooper and Charles Pete Conrad to dub their August 1965 mission 8 Days in a Garbage Can. Gemini 7 astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell fared even worse, orbiting the Earth for 14 days in a space no larger than the front seat of a Volkswagen Beetle, with no good way of disposing of their trash. Yet despite their enduring notoriety, FCAs remain in use to this day as a backup in case the space toilets aboard the ISS fail. By the end of the 1960s, it became clear that if astronauts were to spend long periods of time in space, they needed a more comfortable and dignified means of answering nature's call. The Soviets were the first to fly a proper space toilet, which had been standard equipment on the Soyuz spacecraft since its maiden flight in 1967, and to learn more about this flight's tragic ending, please do see our previous video, The Most Disastrous Space Mission Ever Executed. This installation was made possible by the Soyuz's Large Elliptical Orbital Module, which sits above the bell-shaped descent module and is jettisoned just before re-entry. Like nearly all space toilets developed since, the Soyuz facilities consist of two main parts: a suction hose with a funnel for collecting urine, which is vented into a chamber lined with absorbent foam, and a commode which uses a fan and airflow to suck feces into plastic bags, which are then sealed and stored on board. Meanwhile, the first American space toilet was flown aboard the Skylab space station, which hosted 3 crews between May 1973 and February 1974. Like the Soyuz facilities, the Skylab toilet, designed by the Fairchild Republic Corporation, used a fan to suck feces into a plastic bag. The astronauts then used an electric heater and a vacuum from outside to dry the excrement, preventing it from fermenting and fouling the space station air. A separate suction hose was used to collect urine. Adding to the sanitary arrangements, Skylab was unique in being the first and last spacecraft in history to feature a microgravity shower. This was enclosed in a telescoping cylindrical curtain and featured foot restraints, a water sprayer nozzle on a flexible hose, and a vacuum system for carrying away wastewater. Astronauts were provided with 420 terracloth towels color-coded to each astronaut. Today, astronauts aboard the ISS keep themselves clean using wet wipes, no-rinse shampoo, and similar products. For the Space Transport System, or STS program, better known as the Space Shuttle, NASA developed a new, more sophisticated space toilet known as the Waste Collection System, or WCS. Like earlier systems, the WCS used a vacuum hose to collect urine, though it featured 2 different attachable heads for male and female astronauts. The male head was funnel-shaped, while the female head was elliptical with small holes around the rim to allow airflow and prevent excessive suction. The collected urine was then jettisoned overboard. For taking to number 2, the WCS featured a special seat with foot stirrups, hand holders, a seatbelt, and a roller coaster-esque thigh restraint system to hold the astronaut in place. Early versions of the design featured a rapidly spinning slinger/shredder mechanism to break up the waste and direct it onto the walls of the collection tank. However, astronauts understandably objected to having what amounted to a giant garbage disposal so close to their private parts, so the design was changed to use a suction fan as in the earlier space toilets. This fan distributed the waste onto the walls of a cylindrical collection tank, and after they finished their business, astronauts would open a valve to expose the tank to the vacuum of space. Flash freeze drying the contents and preventing odors from forming. Toilet paper, wipes, and other hygiene products were placed in sealed plastic bags and disposed of in a separate compartment. To ensure a tight seal and minimize leakage, the hole in the WCS seat was only about 100 millimeters or 4 inches in diameter, much smaller than on a conventional toilet. Precise positioning of the user's body was therefore essential, and prior to flight, astronauts underwent extensive training on a space toilet simulator, yes really, at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. This simulator featured lights to indicate to the trainee if they were in the proper position, as well as an internal camera to allow an instructor to check on the trainee's alignment. And you thought your work on boarding was awkward. As everybody is different, each astronaut quickly learns what position worked best for them. As veteran American astronaut Mike Massimo explains, "I think of Peter Fonda in Easy Rider. That's the right position for me." Adding to the indignity, the genuine article aboard the space shuttle itself featured a microphone so flight surgeons back on Earth could monitor the astronauts' bowel sounds and gauge their overall digestive health. This in turn led to the creation of what has to be the least glamorous job in the history of space exploration. In the early days of the shuttle program, NASA was often contracted by the US military to deploy top-secret surveillance satellites from the orbiter's cargo bay. Military intelligence worried that the microphone on the WCS might accidentally pick up conversations about the classified payload, and so some unfortunate officer was tasked with listening to days of astronaut bowel sounds to ensure that no national secrets leaked out. Now your boring day job doesn't sound so bad, does it? The only saving grace is that while the flight surgeon could hear an astronaut's every sound, their fellow crewmates couldn't. Despite the WCS being separated from the rest of the cabin only by a thin curtain, the sounds of various pumps and other onboard systems were so loud that the astronauts could use the facilities in relative sonic privacy. But while far superior to the hated Apollo FCA bags, the WCS was not without its faults, and over the Space Shuttle's 30-year service life, the system suffered a number of major malfunctions. During STS-3, the third shuttle flight in March 1982, the WCS failed on its first use, forcing the 2-man crew, Commander Jack Loosmer and pilot C. Gordon Fullerton, to use FCA bags for the rest of the 8-day flight. On September 3rd, 1984, during STS-41D, the maiden flight of the Space Shuttle Discovery, a malfunction in the liquid disposal system led to the formation of a 60-centimeter or 2-foot-long frozen pesicle on the orbiter's hull. Thankfully, the following day, Mission Commander Henry Hartsfield Jr. managed to break off the obstruction using the shuttle's remote manipulator arm, aka the Canadarm. The WCS also had a more fundamental design flaw. Sometimes bits of freeze-dried feces would flake off the tank walls and float out through the bowl into the cabin, fouling the air. But the most serious malfunction of the WCS occurred on November 23rd, 1989, Thanksgiving Day, during the STS-33 Discovery's 9th flight. Early that morning, Mission Commander Fred Gregory awoke to use the facilities. Everything went well at first, but when Gregory made to seal off and depressurize the collection tank, the valve connecting the tank to the outside opened, but the slider valve connecting the tank to the bowl failed to close. Suddenly, the cabin and Gregory's backside were exposed to the vacuum of space, suctioning him fast to his seat. To make matters worse, the vent for topping up the shuttle's atmosphere with fresh oxygen was located right above the WCS, so not only was Gregory stuck in place, the shuttle's precious air roaring past his most delicate bits, but he was also being doused with a shower of ice-cold, recently liquefied oxygen. Immediately, the cabin depressurization warning klaxon blared, and Gregory's crewmates rushed to the rescue. Mission specialist Story Musgrave managed to wrestle the stuck slider valve shut, freeing a grateful, if very chilled, Gregory, but now the crew of STS-33 faced an unpleasant dilemma. If they could not fix the troublesome valve, they would be forced to use the dreaded FCA bags for the rest of the 5-day mission. Unsurprisingly, the crew overwhelmingly voted to scrub the mission and return to Earth rather than have to face this option. However, this would have required the shuttle to come down at one of its alternative landing sites in Africa, as it was off track for a conventional landing at the Kennedy Space Center. Thankfully, after consulting with Mission Control, the astronauts determined that by ripping off the front cover of the WCS and clamping a pair of vice grip pliers to the slider valve lever, they could continue to safely use their cosmic commode, proving that Clint Eastwood was right in Gran Torino. You can fix anything with duct tape, WD-40, and vice grips. Their scatological scare averted, the crew tucked into their Thanksgiving dinner of turkey, potatoes, and broccoli, and enjoyed a largely uneventful mission. In the year 2000, NASA introduced a new toilet for use on board the International Space Station, which had just begun construction 2 years before. Though broadly similar to the Space Shuttle, WCS, the ISS toilets use not a single collection tank, but rather 20-litre or 5-gallon micro-perforated plastic bags held in an aluminium container. The micro-perforations allow air, but not liquids or solids, to flow through the plastic, allowing the toilet fan to pull waste to the bottom of the bag. Once full, the containers are sealed, and along with the rest of the space station's trash, are loaded aboard unmanned Grumman Cygnus or Russian Progress supply spacecraft to burn up in the atmosphere. So now you know. If you look up at the night sky and see a particularly bright shooting star, there's a good chance there might be astronaut poop inside it. Yet despite numerous improvements to the design, using the ISS toilet is still far from a pleasant experience, with most astronauts listing going to the bathroom as their least favourite part of spaceflight. As veteran astronaut Peggy Whitson, who holds the NASA record for most time spent in space at 665 days, explains, after the collection bag starts getting full, you have to put a rubber glove on and pack it down. Meanwhile, urine is collected, much as it has been for decades, using a separate vacuum hose with male and female adapters. However, since water is such a precious commodity and very heavy and bulky to launch into orbit, urine is not jettisoned overboard as in previous systems, but rather recycled into potable drinking water via a sophisticated reclamation system called the Water Processor Assembly, or WPA, which uses a series of microfilters and catalyst beds to remove and neutralize contaminants. As NASA astronaut Jessica Moore explains, we recycle about 90% of all water-based liquids on the space station, including urine and sweat. What we try to do aboard the space station is mimic elements of Earth's natural water cycle to reclaim water from the air. And when it comes to our urine on ISS, today's coffee is tomorrow's coffee. As in previous space programs, some of the astronauts' waste is stored and returned to Earth for analysis by flight surgeons. Urine is first collected in plastic bags, very similar to the urine collection devices used by the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. Syringes are then used to extract samples, which are stored in a special compartment called the -80-degree laboratory freezer for ISS, or MELFI, until they can be returned to Earth by a Soyuz or Dragon spacecraft. As of this recording, solid waste is not processed to extract its moisture, though NASA is working on it. In 2021, the agency also sent a brine processor unit to the ISS to reclaim the remaining water that can't be processed by the WPA. The goal is to achieve at least 98% reclamation before sending first humans to Mars. So, good news for all of you Dune fans out there, real-life still suits may just be around the corner. Currently, there are 3 toilets aboard the ISS located in the Zvezda, Nauka, and Tranquility modules. Like the earlier shuttle WCS, these toilets have a less-than-perfect track record, with the most serious failure occurring on May 21, 2008, when the pump for the liquid waste collection system broke. At the time, there was only 1 toilet on board the ISS, forcing the astronauts to use bags or the toilet aboard the attached Soyuz spacecraft for urine collection. The solid waste system remained unaffected. Thankfully, the launch of STS-124 was scheduled for launch just 10 days later, so a replacement pump was overnighted from Russia to the Kennedy Space Center in a diplomatic pouch and successfully delivered to the ISS on June 2nd. It is estimated that the 3 toilets on board the ISS have some kind of breakdown, thankfully almost always minor, around once each month. But with NASA preparing to send astronauts back to the moon and eventually to Mars, even the relatively advanced toilets aboard the ISS are no longer adequate. Consequently, in 2018, NASA introduced the next generation of space waste disposal, the Universal Management System, or UWMS. Costing $23 million to develop, the UWMS is 40% lighter, 65% more compact, and significantly more energy efficient than the existing ISS toilets, allowing it to be more easily integrated into the Orion capsules slated to travel to the moon on the upcoming Artemis missions. When installed aboard the ISS or Mars-bound spacecraft, the UWMS will connect to onboard water reclamation systems, or while on shorter duration missions like Artemis, the waste will simply be stored in a tank for later disposal. UWMS is also designed for greater comfort and ergonomics, with a tilted form-fitting seat and an elongated integrated funnel that allows astronauts to urinate and defecate at the same time. Greater care was also taken to make the new toilet convenient for both men and women to use. But while the UWMS represents the current state-of-the-art of space toilet design, one major spaceflight problem remains unsolved: how to adequately manage waste collection in a spacesuit. Currently, this is handled through the use of maximum absorbency garments, aka adult diapers, but this is only adequate for current EVAs, which typically last only a few hours. Long-duration EVAs, such as those astronauts might encounter on future missions to the moon or Mars, are a completely different animal. Collection of urine is fairly straightforward, but for men only. The specifics of female anatomy, including the shape of the genital region, the presence of pubic hair, and the realities of menstruation, greatly complicate the process. While some of these problems could be mitigated by, for example, having female astronauts shave their pubic hair and go on birth control to regulate their menstrual cycles, this is beyond what NASA is willing to ask of its astronauts. Instead, the agency is seeking an entirely hardware-based solution. For example, in 1981, NASA patented a female urine collection device with a vaginal insert to prevent stray urine droplets or particles of feces from drifting into the vagina and causing infections. However, such a system has not yet been successfully integrated into any practical spacesuit. The problem of solid waste disposal is even more vexing, as containment is far more difficult to achieve, and fecal matter is far more difficult to handle automatically than liquid waste. Consequently, in 2016, NASA launched the wonderfully named Space Poop Challenge, which offered $15,000 to any inventor who could come up with a practical spacesuit waste management system. The top prize was clinched by flight surgeon and family physician Dr. Thatcher Cardon, who developed his prototypes on evenings and weekends with the help of his wife and kids. Cardon's system features a small access port integrated to the crotch of the spacesuit, to which various bags and hoses can be attached to remove solid and liquid waste. According to Cardon, the port could also be used to perform emergency abdominal surgery and other procedures. But while innovative, the system is nowhere near ready for actual use in space, and as of this recording, the problem of long-term waste management in a spacesuit has not yet been solved. But with NASA working tirelessly on the problem, we can all rest assured that when the first astronaut takes the first dump on the planet Mars, they will be aided by the very best technology that humanity can concoct. At precisely 3 a.m. on the 17th of January 1991, a series of explosions rocked the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. The explosions were exact and devastating, destroying Iraqi military radars, command bunkers, and communications hubs with surgical precision. Immediately, Iraq's aerial defense system sprang into action, its 3,000 anti-aircraft guns saturating the air with explosive shells. But the 60 surface-to-air missile batteries defending the country remained silent, their radars fruitlessly searching the skies for unseen intruders. Little did the Iraqis know that they were up against an entirely new type of weapon, an aircraft designed to be almost invisible to radar, allowing it to penetrate deep into enemy territory and strike at critical targets with impunity. Known as the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, this revolutionary stealth fighter would go on to fly 1,250 sorties and drop more than 2,000 tons of bomb on Iraq without a single aircraft being shot down, helping bring Operation Desert Storm, the UN-backed expulsion of Iraqi forces from Kuwait, to a swift and decisive conclusion. Since then, the F-117's revolutionary technology has proliferated throughout the world's militaries, completely reshaping the face of modern warfare. But how does this technology work? How is it possible to render an entire modern jet aircraft nearly invisible? Well, strap in as we dive into the fascinating history and technology of stealth. In the early days of military aviation, little attention was paid to stealthiness. Anti-aircraft defenses were primitive, and it was more important for aircraft to be easily recognized as friend or foe by ground forces and other aircraft. For this reason, during the First World War, aircraft were prominently marked with national insignia, like British and French tricolor roundels or the German Balkenkreuz. But as the war progressed and aviation technology improved, greater emphasis was placed on camouflage both on the ground and in the air. Most nations thus adopted various camouflage schemes, generally consisting of pale blue or tan lower surfaces to blend in against the sky and green or brown upper surfaces to match the ground below. One unusually elaborate scheme was the lozenge camouflage used by the Luftstreitkräfte or Imperial German Air Force. This consisted of a pattern of 4 or 5-sided polygons in a variety of colors, including blue, gray, green, black, purple, and even pink, and they were pre-printed on fabric that was used to cover aircraft wings and fuselages. These disruptive patterns were intended to break up the aircraft's outline against the ground and the sky, and were printed in a number of versions for use on upper and lower surfaces and for day and night operations. However, even late into the war, many fighter pilots eschewed camouflage for garish color schemes intended to aid unit cohesion, display national pride and individuality, and intimidate the enemy. For example, pilots of Jagdgeschwader 1, the famous flying circus commanded by top German ace Manfred von Richthofen, aka the Red Baron, painted their aircraft bright crimson, while those of Jaster 6 opted for zebra-like black and white stripes. Despite this, the Germans did make the first attempt to build a truly stealthy aircraft. In 1916, they replaced the fabric covering of a Fokker E-3 monoplane fighter with sheets of an early transparent plastic called Cellon, creating something that looked like the ancestor of Wonder Woman's invisible jet. Unfortunately, testing revealed that while the aircraft was indeed difficult to spot against a clear sky, in cloudy conditions, light reflecting off the shiny Cellon skin actually made the aircraft even more visible. So, back to the drawing board. While the Germans did not pursue this approach any further, in 1935 the Soviet engineer Sergei Kozlov tried building his own transparent aircraft, a modified Yakolev Air-4 reconnaissance plane known as the Kozlov PS. However, the Soviets ran into the same problems as the Germans 2 decades before, and this project too was soon scrapped. In the interwar period, relatively few advancements were made in the field of aircraft camouflage. Indeed, the growing doctrine of air power, championed by theorists like Italian Army Major Giulio Duhay, held that modern bomber aircraft flew too high and fast and were too heavily armed to be shot down, allowing them to attack their targets with impunity. This conceit, which British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin described as "the bomber will always get through," made camouflaging an aircraft's approach redundant. However, several outside thinkers' circles saw the advantages of aerial camouflage and tried to sell the military on their theories. Among these was New Hampshire artist Abbott Henderson Thayer, who, after observing and painting countless animals in the wild, came up with a theory of camouflage known as countershading. According to Thayer, the dark upper and light lower coloration of most animals serves to camouflage them against their environment by countering the effects of light and shadow. Normally, direct sunlight makes an animal appear light above and dark below. Countershadowing, however, darkens the light areas and lightens the dark, reducing the animal's contrast against its background and making it appear flat. Or as Thayer himself described the effect in his 1909 book Concealing Coloration in the Animal Kingdom, animals are painted by nature darkest on those parts which tend to be most lighted by the sky's light and vice versa. The fact that a vast majority of creatures of the whole animal kingdom wear this gradation, developed to an exquisitely minute degree, and are famous for being hard to see in their homes, speaks for itself. Thayer's conclusions are now disputed, with modern zoologists arguing that not all countershading in animals is related to camouflage, and that certain color schemes are instead intended for display, warning, or thermoregulation purposes. Nonetheless, based on his observations in 1902, Thayer filed a patent on the use of countershading to camouflage ships at sea, and during the First World War tried to convince the US Navy to adopt his methods. But the Navy was uninterested and ignored him. Shortly before the Second World War, zoologist Hugh Cott took up the cause and tried to sell the British Armed Forces on the concept of countershading. Unfortunately, Cott had the misfortune of being the protege of John Graham Kerr, a biologist who during the First World War had argued with artist Norman Wilkinson over the effectiveness of dazzle camouflage, a scheme to paint ships in bold black and white stripes to break up their outlines and protect them from submarines. And for more on this bizarre form of camouflage, please check out our previous video, Why Were So Many British and American Warships in World War I Painted Like Zebras? In 1939, Norman Wilkinson was serving as the British Army's Inspector of Camouflage and thus held enormous influence over how military vehicles and equipment were painted. Despite this, Hugh Cott was invited to take part in an experiment in which 2 12-inch railway guns were camouflaged, one using Cott's countershading method and the other using conventional techniques. The guns were then photographed from the air from different angles. According to observer Peter Forbes, the contrast was striking. Cott's gun was invisible except to the most minute scrutiny by someone who knows exactly where to to look and what to look for. The other gun is always highly visible. Though this should have vindicated Cott, the demonstration embarrassed the army and they refused to adopt Cott's ideas, arguing that his scheme was too complicated to apply properly. Then, in order to get the troublesome zoologist out of the way, the army posted him to the Middle East. But while countershading was never formally adopted by any armed forces during the Second World War, Thayer and Cott's ideas nevertheless influenced camouflage doctrine throughout the conflict. Most nations' fighting aircraft were painted some combination of pale blue or grey blue below and darker colours matching the surrounding terrain above, roughly approximating a countershaded scheme. In addition, reconnaissance aircraft like versions of the British Supermarine Spitfire and American Lockheed P-38 Lightning were painted all over in a special dark azure colour known as PRU blue. Developed by Australian inventor Sidney Cotton, the colour helped these unarmed aircraft blend against the dark sky at high altitudes. The war also saw the development of an unusual camouflage system known as the Yehudi lights. From 1943 onwards, the introduction of long-range patrol aircraft allowed the Allies to turn the tide against German U-boats, which had been decimating merchant traffic in the North Atlantic since the very first day of the war. However, U-boat crews often spotted these slow-moving aircraft from several kilometers away, giving them enough time to crash dive and slip away. Some method was thus needed to conceal these aircraft's approach, allowing them to sneak up on unsuspecting U-boats. Developed by the US Navy in 1943, Yehudi lights consisted of a set of electric lights attached to the leading edges of an aircraft's wings and powered by an onboard generator. When activated, these lights washed out and broke up the aircraft's dark silhouette, making it harder to see against the bright sky. This is similar in principle to the technique of counter-illumination used by certain sea creatures like the midwater squid. The underside of these squid are covered in light-producing organs called photophores, which, when activated, help lighten it to conceal its silhouette when seen from below. The system's unusual name came from the late 1930s slang phrase, "Who's Yehudi?" used to refer to a mysterious or absent person. In 1945, Yehudi lights were tested aboard a Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. Promisingly, while a regular aircraft was detected at a range of 19 kilometers, the Yehudi-equipped Avenger got within 3 kilometers, around 30 seconds flying time, of the test ship before being spotted, too close for a U-boat to crash dive. A system called diffused lighting camouflage was also tested by the Royal Canadian Navy and consisted of a series of spotlights aimed at the sides of a ship to counter-illuminate and conceal its silhouette against the sky. Between 1941 and 1943, the system was installed experimentally on a number of RCN vessels, including the Flower-class corvette HMCS Rimouski, which in September 1943 spotted and intercepted the German submarine U-536 in the Baie de Chaleur in Quebec. The U-boat appeared not to see Rimouski approaching, and the ship moved in for the kill. Unfortunately, at the last moment, a stray radio communication from the shore alerted U-536's commander, Captain Lieutenant Schauenberg, and the submarine succeeded in crash diving and escaping. Despite these promising results, neither Yehudi lights nor diffused lighting camouflage were used operationally during the war, though the idea may be making a comeback. In 2008, researchers from the University of Kansas covered a small drone in electroluminescent panels whose color could be matched to the sky. Flying at 300 meters, the drone became almost invisible to the naked eye. By the time such visual camouflage systems came of age, however, they had been rendered all but redundant by one of World War II's game-changing technological inventions, radar. Developed independently by the Germans and the British in the late 1930s, radar, short for radio detection and ranging, works by emitting a beam of microwaves which bounce off the target and are detected by the radar receiver, allowing the target's position and speed to be measured. For the first time, radar allowed incoming aircraft to be detected far beyond visual and auditory range, giving ample warning of an attack and sufficient time for anti-aircraft defenses to be deployed. Indeed, the British chain-home radar system and its associated ground control interception network, the Dowding system, was a pivotal factor in allowing the Royal Air Force to defeat the German Luftwaffe during the 1940 Battle of Britain. Meanwhile, the German Kammerbill line, a network of Freya and Wurzburg radars, radar-controlled searchlights and anti-aircraft guns and night fighters made the skies over Germany deadly for RAF bombers attempting to pound Nazi industry into submission. Early attempts at radar countermeasures, however, focused not on making aircraft less detectable, but rather on jamming and confusing the radar itself. The simplest of these countermeasures was codenamed Window, which consisted of thin strips of aluminium foil dropped in bundles out of aircraft. These clouds of aluminium returned massive radio echoes, overwhelming and blinding the German radar operators. Window turned out to be one of the Allies' most effective secret weapons, being used to devastating effect during the firebombing of Hamburg in July 1943 and the massive deception campaign in the lead up to the D-Day landings in June 1944. And for more on this, please do check out our previous video, Operation Bodyguard, the grand deception that made D-Day possible. Modern versions of window, known as chaff, are still carried by military aircraft today, and along with high-temperature infrared flares are launched in order to defeat radar and infrared-guided anti-aircraft missiles. The Allies also developed a number of active electronic jamming systems, including Moonshine, Cigar, Grocer, and Jostle, which broadcast powerful radio systems intended to overwhelm German radar and night fighter radio systems. While no World War II aircrafts were deliberately designed to be invisible to radar, a few managed to achieve this ability by accident, including the British de Havilland Mosquito light bomber. Due to wartime metal shortages, the Mosquito was built almost entirely of laminated plywood, which happened to be transparent to German radar. While the Mosquito's large metal engines and propellers still returned radar echoes, the wooden airframes gave the aircraft the radar cross-section of a much smaller aircraft, making it much harder to detect and track. A fundamental term when discussing stealth technology, radar cross-section, or RCS, refers to the size of a spherical metal reflector that would return the equivalent radar echo of a particular vehicle. While it is impossible to make an aircraft completely invisible to radar, modern stealth techniques can reduce the radar cross-section of an aircraft the size of the Northrop Grumman B-2 Spirit, a bomber with a 52-meter wingspan, down to the size of a tennis ball. Another World War II aircraft commonly believed to have stealth capabilities was the experimental German Horten Ho 229 flying wing jet fighter. A futuristic design, the Horten lacked a fuselage or vertical tail surfaces, parts of regular aircraft that are excellent radar reflectors. Like the Mosquito, it was also built largely of wood and was even coated in paint containing carbon particles intended to absorb radar waves. Theoretically, all of this should have made the Horten the world's first true stealth aircraft, but the war ended before it could see service. In 2008, however, the Northrop Grumman Corporation and the National Geographic Society teamed up to evaluate the advanced German jet's anti-radar capabilities. The team constructed a full-size, non-flying mock-up, took it to Northrop Grumman's radar test range at Tejon, California, and exposed it to radar waves of various frequencies. These tests revealed that the model had a radar cross-section around 40% that of a standard German World War II fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. However, this experiment failed to account for two important factors. First, the real aircraft was not built entirely of wood and featured an internal steel structure, and second, its twin jet engines, especially their spinning compressor blades, would have been very strong radar reflectors. These two factors combined would have made the Horten stealth capabilities marginal at best. Even the innovative carbon-laced paint was found to be largely ineffective against World War II-era radars. Indeed, the first deliberate application of radar stealth technology took place not in the air, but at sea. The development of a centimetric airborne radar gave the Allies a huge advantage in the Battle of the Atlantic, allowing patrol aircraft to detect objects as small as a submarine periscope on the ocean surface from several kilometers away. In response, the Germans developed innovative radar-absorbing materials, codenamed Schornsteinfeger and Sumpf, which was applied to U-boat periscopes and the snorkels that they used to run their diesel engines while submerged. These materials were effectively versions of the Salisbury screen developed by American engineer Winfield Salisbury in the early 1940s. This consisted of a sheet of insulating material of a particular thickness sandwiched between a metal screen and a solid metal sheet. When a radar wave hit the screen, it split into two components. One half of the wave reflected off the screen, while the second traveled through it and bounced off the solid metal layer. The two waves then cancelled each other out through the destructive interference, causing the object to which they were applied to return a much weaker signal. The Germans also pioneered a form of acoustic stealth technology to protect U-boats against ASTIC, the Allied code name for active sonar. Codenamed Arborich after the invisible dwarf from Germanic mythology, this took the form of special rubber tires applied to the hull of the U-boat. The tires were covered in specially shaped holes which would absorb any ASTIC sound waves that struck them. Arborich was applied experimentally to a handful of U-boats, including the U-480. The coating proved highly effective, with the U-480's commander managing to sink 4 ships in 5 days in August 1944 without ever being detected by the Allies. Unfortunately, the war ended before the technology could be implemented on a wider scale. Today, however, anechoic tiles like Arborich are a common feature on many military submarines. The development of true stealth technology would have to wait until the post-war period, but only after some hard lessons were learned in combat. In the early years of the Cold War, the main Western strategy for defeating Soviet air defenses was simply to fly too high and too fast to be intercepted. In 1956, Lockheed Aircraft introduced the U-2, a spy plane designed to penetrate deep into Soviet airspace and photograph strategic military installations. Essentially a jet-powered glider with enormous 31-meter wings, the U-2 was hardly stealthy, but it could cruise at an altitude of 24,000 meters, far higher than any Soviet fighter or missile could reach. So, while Soviet radar easily tracked the U-2 overflight, flights for 4 years, the aircraft enjoyed relative immunity from attack. Then, on May 1st, 1960, U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down by a Soviet S-75 Dvina missile while on a mission over Sverdlovsk. In addition to sparking a major diplomatic incident, the shoot-down revealed that Soviet missile technology had caught up with the U-2 and that some method was now needed to conceal future overflights. Thankfully, Lockheed had already initiated a project codenamed Rainbow with the goal of making the U-2 less visible to radar. Ultimately, 3 solutions were developed, codenamed Trapeze, Wires, and Wallpaper. Trapeze and wires consisted of fine steel wires mounted on short fiberglass pylons strung along the leading and trailing edges of the wings and along the sides of the fuselage, which broke up and scattered radar waves, while Wallpaper was a Salisbury screen-based radar-absorbing material applied to the aircraft's fuselage. Unfortunately, testing revealed that these modifications were only marginally effective against Soviet radar. They also produced significant drag and seriously impacted performance, costing the U-2 1,500 meters in altitude and 2,200 kilometers in range. Even worse, the Wallpaper material acted as a thermal insulator and caused the engine to overheat, with fatal consequences. During an April 2nd, 1957 test flight, heat buildup caused the aircraft's engine to fail. This, in turn, caused the cabin to depressurize and test pilot Robert Saiker's pressure suit to pop open. Saiker immediately lost consciousness and the aircraft entered a flat spin and spiraled towards the ground. Though Saiker eventually regained consciousness and bailed out, he was too close to the ground and was killed. Nonetheless, operational flights of the modified U-2s, codenamed Dirty Birds or Covered Wagons, began in July 1957. A total of 9 missions were flown before the system was deemed ineffective and the project was abandoned. With the U-2 quickly becoming obsolete, Lockheed decided to take a different approach to defeating Soviet air defenses. Rather than outclimbing Soviet fighters and missiles, they would instead outrun them. The result was the A-12 Oxcart, a futuristic titanium spy plane capable of flying at more than 3 times the speed of sound. While the A-12 and the later SR-71 Blackbird's main defense was their sheer speed, great effort was also taken to minimize their radar cross-section, the first aircraft to be so designed from the ground up. Stealth features included angled vertical tail surfaces and a sharp chine around the fuselage to deflect radar waves away from the aircraft, the use of radar-absorbing composite materials in many components, and fuel additives to make the jet exhaust less detectable to infrared sensors. The result was an aircraft with the radar cross-section of a Piper Cub, a civilian recreational aircraft about half its size. However, the first stealth aircraft as we understand the term today would not appear until the 1980s, with the technology that made it possible coming, ironically, from the Soviet Union. In 1962, Soviet physicist Pyotr Ufimtsev published a groundbreaking paper titled Method of Edge Waves in the Physical Theory of Diffraction, in which he described how to accurately calculate radar cross-section of any shape and how to design a shape that would reflect the majority of radar waves away from its source. Though it attracted little interest in Russia, the paper was secretly translated into English and in 1975 came to the attention of Lockheed radar specialist Denis Overholzer. Overholzer realized that Ufimtsev's theories could be used to render an aircraft nearly invisible to radar. Based on his recommendations, Lockheed and the US government approved a development program under the codename Have Blue. The design of the specially shaped stealth airframe was undertaken by engineer Bill Schroeder. As 1970s computers were not powerful enough to analyze complex curved shapes, Schroeder designed the aircraft entirely out of flat-angled planes to make the analysis easier, a technique now known as faceting. This, however, resulted in a shape that was completely unstable in flight. Thankfully, recent developments in computerized stability augmentation systems, also known as fly-by-wire, allowed the radical new aircraft to be made flyable. The result of Have Blue was a pair of subscale technology demonstrator aircraft that looked unlike anything the world had ever seen. Wedge-shaped and covered in sharp-angled facets, the aircraft looked so unaerodynamic that its builders jokingly nicknamed it the Hopeless Diamond. In addition to its trademark faceting, Have Blue integrated a number of other RCS-reducing features, including sharply angled vertical tail surfaces like the A-12 and SR-71. On regular aircraft, the most radar-reflective features tend to be cavities like the cockpit, engine intakes, and wheel wells, as well as moving parts like spinning jet engine compressor blades. Thus, on Have Blue, great care was taken to hide or fare over these features. The steeply angled canopy was coated in a thin layer of gold, which reflected radar waves away from the cockpit while not affecting the pilot's vision. The engines were buried deep in the fuselage, with protective screens covering the intakes, while heat-absorbing tiles lining the exhaust ducts reduced the exhaust's temperature and the aircraft's infrared signature. Finally, the whole aircraft was covered in special paint impregnated with tiny iron spheres, which would absorb radar waves and dissipate their energy in the form of heat. Have Blue made its maiden flight on December 1st, 1977, above Groom Lake in Nevada, better known as Area 51. The test program revealed that the aircraft worked exactly as intended. The stability augmentation system allowed for smooth, controllable flight, while the stealth features reduced the aircraft's RCS to that of a marble. While both prototypes were destroyed by mechanical problems unrelated to their stealth features, the program was considered successful enough for Lockheed to proceed to the next phase, codenamed Senior Trent. The result was the F-117 Nighthawk, which made its maiden flight on June 18, 1981. Though popularly known as the stealth fighter, the F-117 was designed from the outset as a bomber capable of penetrating deep into enemy territory and carrying out precision strikes using laser-guided munitions. In addition to the stealth features developed by Have Blue, the F-117 lacked radar or any other transmitters that could betray its presence and carried its weapons in an internal bomb bay. 64 F-117s were produced, the type first seeing combat during the US invasion of Panama in 1989. The Nighthawk remained in service for 25 years, finally being retired in 2008. In that time, only one Nighthawk was ever lost in combat, an aircraft flown by Lieutenant Colonel Daryl Zelko, shot down by a missile over Yugoslavia on March 27, 1999. The success of the F-117 paved the way for further advances in stealth technology. In 1989, the same year the F-117 was first deployed, the Northrop Corporation, now Northrop Grumman, introduced the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Echoing the design of the wartime German Horten 229, the B-2 is a pure flying wing with no vertical tail services and a crew compartment, engines, and internal bomb bay smoothly blended into its chevron-shaped wing. As previously mentioned, these features, along with its buried engine intakes and radar-absorbing paint, help give the B-2 an RCS equivalent to a tennis ball. Though originally designed to penetrate Soviet airspace and destroy strategic targets using nuclear warheads, the end of the Cold War relegated the B-2 to the controversial bombing role, the type being used for air support in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. However, the aircraft's unique capabilities come at a tremendous cost, with the 21-strong B-2 fleet being valued at nearly $2 billion apiece. In recent years, stealth technology has been incorporated into an increasing number of military vehicles. Aircraft like the American Lockheed F-22 Raptor and F-35 Lightning II, the Russian Sukhoi Su-57, and the Chinese Chengdu J-20 all incorporate stealth features pioneered by the F-117, including faceting, internal weapons bays, and metal-coated canopies, though modern computer software has allowed engineers to design more curved aerodynamic airframe shapes that do not require as much computer correction to render stable. Many of these aircraft also incorporate what are known as radar-absorbing structures, with special cavities that absorb and dissipate incoming radar waves. The effect is what one engineer likens to an electromagnetic roach motel. Radar waves check in, but they never check out. Many modern naval vessels also feature a stealthy, faceted design, including the French Lafayette class, Dutch De Zeven Provinciën class, and the Swedish Visby class. But while stealth has been a game-changer in the fields of aerial and naval warfare, if history has taught us anything, it's that on the technological battlefield, no tactical or strategic advantage is maintained for very long. New weapons lead to new countermeasures, and so on. And it is only a matter of time before new technologies render stealth as obsolete as the introduction of radar-made visual camouflage during the Second World War. Indeed, developments in multi-beam and low-frequency radar and enhanced infrared imaging are already beginning to chip away at modern stealth effectiveness. And nobody knows what the future is going to hold. Imagine an enormous bullet-shaped spaceship weighing 10,000 tons and towering 100 meters into the sky. Suddenly, there's a searing flash of light as the craft is enveloped in a giant atomic fireball. But when the light dims, the ship has not been vaporized. Rather, it has been lifted several hundred meters off the ground. It hangs in midair for a split second before the sky is once again flooded with light, the blast lofting the ship even higher. Another blast follows, and another, until the craft is rocketing through the sky at tremendous speed, sailing past the Earth's atmosphere and eventually its gravitational pull. While this scene might seem straight out of a particularly cheesy 1950s sci-fi movie, it came astonishingly close to becoming reality. For nearly a decade, a group of American scientists attempted to build a giant interplanetary spacecraft propelled by the detonations of thousands of atomic bombs. But while ultimately this effort never got off the ground, it was not nearly as insane as it might seem. Indeed, even today, so-called nuclear pulse propulsion remains our only practical means of overcoming the limitations of conventional rocketry and venturing out into the solar system and beyond. This is the incredible, forgotten story of Project Orion. The idea of propelling a vehicle using explosives, it dates back to at least the 1890s when German inventor Hermann Gansfeld first proposed sending a rocket into space using sequential dynamite charges. However, the concept of using nuclear explosives would not appear until nearly half a century later, springing from the fertile mind of Polish mathematician Stanislaw Ulam. Born in 1909 to a wealthy Jewish family, Ulam moved to the United States in 1939 to escape the Nazis, and in 1943 was invited to join the Manhattan Project, the top-secret effort to build the first atomic bomb. Assigned to the project's main laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Ulam worked on the implosion-type bomb design, performing hydrodynamic calculations for the high-explosive lenses that would compress the weapon's plutonium core to criticality. These efforts paid off when, in the early morning hours of July 16, 1945, the world's first atomic bomb, codenamed Trinity, or simply the Gadget, was detonated at Alamogordo, unleashing the equivalent explosive power of 25,000 tons of TNT. 1 month later, on August 9th, a nearly identical bomb, codenamed Fat Man, was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, killing an estimated 80,000 people. At the same time, Ulam began working with the Hungarian physicist Edward Teller on the design of an even more powerful bomb, which Teller dubbed the Super. This used a conventional atomic bomb to heat and compress a mass of deuterium and tritium, heavy isotopes of hydrogen, to trigger a nuclear fusion reaction and boost the weapon's yield from kilotons to megatons. While early calculations showed the concept to be infeasible, in 1951 Teller and Ulam came up with a workable design which was successfully tested on November 1, 1952 in the Ivy Mike nuclear test at Enewetak Atoll in the South Pacific. The so-called Teller-Ulam design forms the basis of every thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb in use today. But while the atomic bomb and hydrogen bombs were originally created as weapons of war, in the post-war period, nuclear scientists began exploring more peaceful applications for their creations. These efforts led to Project Plowshare in the United States and nuclear explosions for the national economy in the Soviet Union, which investigated the practicality of using nuclear explosives for, among other things, digging harbors and canals, stimulating oil and gas production, generating electricity, and even putting out oil well fires. Another early proposed application of nuclear power was in rocket propulsion for both military weapons and the peaceful exploration of space. At first, such efforts focused on the use of lightweight nuclear reactors to heat a working fluid, which was then expelled through a nozzle to generate thrust. Such designs have numerous advantages over conventional chemical rocket engines. First, nuclear fission has an energy density more than 1 million times higher than even the most energetic chemical reactions. Second, even the lightest chemical rocket propellants like hydrogen and oxygen invariably produce combustion products heavier than the original reactants, in this case water. As thrust is proportional to the velocity of the rocket's engine exhaust, which in turn is inversely proportional to the mass of the molecules in said exhaust, this places an upper limit on the performance achievable with chemical propellants. Nuclear rocket engines, on the other hand, can use hydrogen, the lightest of all elements, directly as a working fluid, allowing them to achieve a specific impulse, that is, thrust per mass of propellant consumed per second, more than twice that of chemical rocket engines. Research on such engines began in 1955 under the Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC's Project Rover, though when the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was founded in 1958, the project was transferred over and renamed Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Application, or NERVA. Among other applications, NERVA was originally intended to power the upper stage of the Nova and Saturn V rockets, then being designed to carry astronauts to the moon. But while the basic principle of a nuclear rocket engine is simple, Rover and NERVA engineers quickly discovered just how difficult it is to implement in practice. Perhaps the greatest challenge was dealing with the huge amounts of lethal radiation given off by the reactor, as well as finding construction materials both light enough to fly and strong enough to withstand the forces of flight and the high temperatures in the core. Indeed, this proved the key limiting factor of the entire concept. The hotter the working fluid, the more efficient the engine, but as material limitations capped the core temperature at around 1600 degrees Celsius, much of the tremendous energy potential of nuclear rocket propulsion remained untapped. However, Stanislaw Ulam had already come up with a unique, if radical, solution to this problem. Instead of releasing the power of nuclear fission continuously, as in a reactor, to propel a spaceship, why not release it instantaneously using atomic bombs? Such nuclear pulse propulsion, he reasoned, would be far more efficient than NERVA, for the spacecraft structure would absorb only a tiny amount of heat produced by each detonation, allowing more thrust to be produced. Ulam first wrote down his ideas in 1944, a full year before the Trinity test, and further refined them in a 1947 memorandum co-authored with Frederick Rains, and again in 1955 in a still classified paper written with Cornelius Everett. Others also proposed similar ideas around the same time. For example, engineers at the Glenn L. Martin Company of Santa Ana, California, came up with a nuclear pulse engine with a combustion chamber 40 meters in diameter into which small nuclear charges with yields of around 100 tons of TNT would be injected at a rate of around 1 per second. At the same time, water would be injected to serve as a working fluid, the resulting plasma being vented out a conventional rocket nozzle to generate thrust. This design was calculated to yield a specific impulse of 1,150 seconds, nearly 3 times that of the Rocketdyne J2 hydrogen-oxygen engine used in the upper stage of the S4B stage of the Saturn V. However, due to the large amount of radioactive fallout that would likely be produced by the thousands of rapidly detonating atomic bombs, Martin originally planned to boost its vehicle with conventional chemical rockets to an altitude of 240 kilometers, whereupon the nuclear pulse engine would take over and impart an extra 2,400 meters per second of Delta V energy, enough to escape the Earth's gravity and propel the spacecraft out into the solar system. But while theoretically workable, Martin's designs required a very heavy combustion chamber and support structure to withstand the force of the bombs detonating within. Stanislav Ulam and his various collaborators saw this as unnecessary and inefficient and instead proposed an alternative external combustion design. In this scheme, the nuclear charges would be ejected out of the rear of the spacecraft along with disks of solid fuel. The detonating charges would vaporize the fuel, creating an expanding plume of hot plasma that would impinge on a large metal pusher plate at the rear of the craft, propelling it forward. As there was no need to contain the blasts, much higher yield charges could be used and even higher specific impulse values achieved, up to a whopping 100,000 seconds. Ulam's ideas floated around the nuclear community for several years before coming to the attention of physicist Ted Taylor of General Atomics in San Diego. Taylor specialized in the design of compact nuclear warheads, technology that would be key to the creation of nuclear pulse-powered spacecraft. Furthermore, the Soviet Union had just humiliated the United States by launching Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite into orbit. Taylor saw a nuclear-powered spacecraft as the ideal means of re-establishing American prestige and leapfrogging the Soviets in the nascent space race. Early on, Taylor recognized that a nuclear-powered spacecraft project would not get very far without official government support. So, in July 1958, he approached the U.S. Department of Defense's Advanced Research Project Agency, or ARPA, today the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, and convinced them to fund preliminary research to the tune of $1 million a year. Under the codename Project Orion, Taylor began assembling a team of the country's brightest mathematicians, physicists, and engineers, including Stanislav Ulam, Jaromir Jerry Astle, a Czech-born aeronautical engineer and explosives expert, and British-born theoretical physicist Freeman Dyson, who General Atomics founder Frederick de Hoffman convinced to take a 1-year sabbatical from the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And if that name sounds familiar, no, he's not the vacuum cleaner guy, but he's rather the guy who's the namesake of the Dyson Sphere, a hypothetical megastructure built by a hyper-advanced civilization around a star in order to capture all of its energy. These men were drawn to Project Orion for a variety of reasons. Some simply dreamed of exploring the solar system, while others saw the unique engineering challenges of the project as, in the words of the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, technically sweet. Still others, guilty of the devastation and global tension wrought by the atomic bomb, viewed Iran as a means of redeeming the creation they'd helped bring into the world. Equally enticing was the organization of the project, which Taylor modeled after the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, or Society for Space Travel, the German rocket society of the 1920s and 30s, which counted among its members a young Werner von Braun, later chief engineer behind the V-2 ballistic missile and Saturn V moon rocket. Like the VFR, the Orion project adopted a flat organizational structure, with few hierarchies and little division of labor between its members. Researchers were free to collaborate and tinker across disciplines as they pleased. Whatever the case, Orion represented a fundamental break from the usual engineering philosophy for spacecraft, for unlike chemical rockets, nuclear-powered spacecraft actually became more efficient the larger they were built. As project engineer Harris Mayer explained in a 2003 interview, "I can remember very well when Ted Taylor first explained the Orion idea. He said the nuclear bomb is so strong that if you have a standard-sized spaceship of the type we were thinking about for chemical propellants, the acceleration that you would have, the force on the small mass, would be so large it would pulverize the spaceship." He said, "Let's make it big. Let's make it, instead of a few tons, let's make it a few thousand tons."
And this means, with the same force, you would have much less acceleration. Because it has to be so big, we should change the way we think of spacecraft. Instead of them being designed for the minimum possible weight with just the right strength, which means very fragile, for the operation, let's make it in a standard engineering design, built like the Brooklyn Bridge or a building. Let's make it out of steel, just ordinary steel, and let's make everything about it, life support systems, like a hotel. End quote. Indeed, the Orion team initially proposed contracting construction of the spacecraft to the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics, which had built much of the US Navy's nuclear-powered submarine fleet. The vast engineering latitude afforded by nuclear pulse propulsion would allow astronauts to do things that were unthinkable using chemical rockets, such as establishing a Mars colony in a single 4-week mission, or reaching the outer planets in as little as 7 months. Indeed, Project Orion's unofficial motto was Mars by 1965, Saturn by 1970. Freeman Dyson estimated the development cost of the project at a surprisingly reasonable $100 million per year over 12 years. While this did not factor in the cost of peripheral technology such as spacesuits and scientific instruments, Dyson anticipated that Orion would piggyback off the work of other military and NASA space projects. But even if he had underestimated Orion's cost by an order of magnitude, the final total would still have only come out to around $24 billion, about the same as the Apollo program. And despite the use of nuclear technologies, the fueling costs would also have been roughly on par. While nuclear explosives are expensive, with the average warhead in the US nuclear arsenal costing $1.1 million on average, much of this cost is bound up in the extensive infrastructure of reactors, fuel refining plants, and assembly facilities needed to produce them. Once this upfront investment has been made, the cost of producing additional warheads drops considerably. With suitable refinements, the Orion team estimated that simple, low-yield pulse units could be mass-produced for around $500,000 each. Assuming 1,000 pulse units are needed to lift a payload of 10,000 tons into Earth orbit, this translates to a fueling cost of around $50 per kilogram of payload. By comparison, the Saturn V could carry only 141 tons into low Earth orbit and cost $1.42 million to fuel, a fueling cost of around $10 per kilogram. When all other costs were taken into account, Orion became even more attractive, offering launch costs of $500 per kilogram compared to nearly $10,000 using modern chemical rockets. But before any of this could become a reality, a great many technical problems first had to be overcome. For example, the exploding nuclear pulse units would produce a plume of plasma at temperatures of tens of millions of degrees Celsius, traveling at speeds of up to 31,000 meters per second, and each time the plume impacted the spacecraft's pusher plate, it would burn an ablite away, a thin layer from the surface. Thankfully, there was evidence to suggest that this problem was not as serious as it appeared. Following early nuclear tests at the Nevada test site, Ted Taylor had walked around Ground Zero, picking up pieces of the steel shot towers used to detonate the bombs. To his surprise, every piece could be accounted for, shattered, but not vaporized. Later, during nuclear tests on Enuotok Atoll, Orion physicist Lou Allen had conducted an experiment codenamed Project Viper, in which he hung a set of 1-meter diameter graphite-covered steel spheres on steel wires 10 meters away from a 10-kiloton atomic bomb. Following the blast, the spheres were recovered several kilometers away, but completely intact, only a few micrometers of graphite having been ablated from their surfaces. Further calculations and physical tests conducted using an explosively driven helium plasma generator revealed that as the pusher plate would only be exposed to the plasma from the propelling bombs for around 1 millisecond per pulse, meant that cheap ordinary metals like steel and aluminium were more than durable enough for the job. Later physicists like Freeman Dyson would propose making the pusher plate out of uranium or other heavy elements so that the neutrons from the nuclear pulse units would breed the material into reactor fuel to power a Moon or Mars colony. Other researchers also came up with methods of spraying the pusher plate with graphite or oil between pulses, further reducing or even completely eliminating ablation. Interestingly, this technique was developed entirely by accident when researchers accidentally left oily fingerprints on a test plate and discovered that those areas did not ablate. But even if the pusher plate could survive the detonations, Orion's crew might not, for each pulse would accelerate the Orion spacecraft by up to 100 Gs. That's far more than a human could withstand. Some sort of shock-absorbing system was thus needed to convert these pulses into a smoother, more survivable acceleration. This task was taken up by Jaromir Jerry Astor, who had served in the Czech resistance during the Second World War and was an expert on explosives. Working at Naval Base Point Loma near San Diego, Astor suspended small-scale models of the Orion spacecraft from a tower and detonated 1-pound balls of plastic explosive beneath them. At first, Astle developed a simple shock absorber composed of stacked rubber inner tubes, only to realize that if one of the pulse units failed, the recoiling pusher plate would tear this airbag to pieces. He thus switched to a two-stage spring and shock absorber design similar to that used in cars. The first stage shock absorber was tuned to 4.5 times the explosive pulse frequency, and the second stage to half this frequency, allowing the timing of the explosions to be off by as much as 10 milliseconds. These tests and further calculations confirmed that with properly designed shock absorbers, the 100G nuclear pulses could feasibly be reduced to a far more tolerable 2 to 4 Gs. As one Orion engineer humorously described it, it would be like flying a giant pogo stick into space. Astle also determined that since most of the energy from each pulse would impact the center of the pusher plate, the plate could be made to taper out towards the edges, providing maximum strength for minimum weight. But perhaps the most difficult technical problem to crack was the design of the nuclear pulse units themselves. Early on, Ted Taylor rejected Stanislav Ulam's cumbersome propellant disc concept and combined the bomb and reaction mass into a single unit. The shape of the reaction mass was vital to achieving maximum propulsive efficiency. A regular cylindrical mass creates a flat disc-shaped plasma wave whose energy is mostly directed sideways and away from the pusher plate. Thus, Taylor and the other Orion physicists devised what was effectively a nuclear-shaped charge, which used specially shaped tungsten, uranium, and beryllium oxide guides and fillers to shape X-rays and plasma from the detonating warhead into a long cigar-shaped plasma jet, directing as much energy as possible onto the pusher plate. Another major concern was metal shrapnel from the bomb casing impacting and potentially damaging the pusher plate. For this reason, several alternative materials were proposed for the reaction mass, including polyethylene, plywood, and fiberglass resin. Polyethylene was particularly stable as it easily absorbs neutrons and breaks down into lightweight hydrogen and carbon atoms, producing extremely high exhaust velocities. Much thought was also devoted to the optimum explosive yield for the pulse units. At first, the Orion researchers based their decisions on the smallest yields then achievable using available technology, which was around 0.1 kilotons. Such minuscule warheads had been developed by the US military for use in air-to-air missiles like the AIM-26 Falcon and Air-2 Genie, and portable infantry weapons like the M388 Davy Crockett Recallers Rifle and the Special Atomic Demolition Munition, or SADM. The smaller the pulse unit, the less jarring the acceleration of each pulse would be, though at the cost of having to carry many more pulse units. If a given pulse unit failed or more thrust was needed, additional or more powerful pulse units would be ejected from the spacecraft. At the time, the technology to vary the yield of an atomic bomb by injecting tritium into its core, what's variously known as boosting or dialer yield, was still in its infancy, so the Orion team envisioned carrying multiple varieties of pulse units with different yields, which would be swapped in and ejected at a moment's notice in order to maintain the desired propulsion profile. To achieve this complex mechanical task, Orion engineers consulted with the Coca-Cola Company, hoping to adapt the high-speed machinery used in bottling plants. After many experiments and calculations, the Orion team finally drew up a baseline design for a prototype manned Orion spacecraft measuring 72 meters or around 16 stories high and 42 meters in diameter and weighing 4,000 tons. A ground launch was envisioned, the production of radioactive fallout being mitigated through the use of either a thick metal launch pad or by launching the vehicle from a barge in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The nuclear pulse units would be launched at a frequency of 1 per second, detonating around 30 meters behind the pusher plate. At first, smaller 0.15 kiloton pulse units would be used, but as the vehicle rose higher and the atmosphere became thinner, more powerful 0.2 kiloton units would be swapped in. It was estimated between 800 and 1,000 pulse units would be needed to reach Earth orbit. Various systems were proposed for launching the pulse units, including multiple guns poking over the rim of the pusher plate or rocket-propelled bombs launching from rails, but ultimately a single pneumatic gun mounted in the middle of the pusher plate was found to be perfectly adequate. Yet despite this theoretical process, one major practical question remained unanswered. Would such a craft be stable on ascent, or would variations in the position of the bombs relative to the pusher plate cause it to careen wildly through the air? To find out, Jerry Astle and other Orion engineers built and tested a series of scale-working models dubbed hot rods or put-puts, propelled by regular explosive charges. In the most spectacular of these tests, conducted at Point Loma on November 14, 1959, a hot rod launched itself 56 meters into the air using 6 sequenced explosions before returning to the Earth by parachute, the whole flight lasting 23 seconds. Despite the team's fears, the vehicle stayed perfectly upright throughout the test and needed no additional stabilization systems. There was no doubt any longer. The Orion concept was sound. But just as Orion was starting to come together, The rug was suddenly pulled from under the project. As covered in our previous video, the genius who attempted to launch satellites using an absolutely ginormous gun, early in the space race, the US Army, Navy, and Air Force all jockeyed for control of America's spaceflight efforts, with the Army's Redstone missile launching America's first satellite, Explorer 1, and the Navy's Vanguard rocket its second, Vanguard 1. However, following the formation of NASA in July 1958, the United States government decided to consolidate all civilian spaceflight programs with that agency, and all military programs with the Air Force, leaving Orion as the only spaceflight project under ARPA's umbrella. In late 1959, the agency decided to withdraw its funding, leaving the Orion project scrambling to find a new benefactor. As Orion had been intended from the start for peaceful space exploration, the team initially turned to NASA. There they found an enthusiastic supporter in Werner von Braun, then director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, who reportedly fell out of his chair when shown footage of the November 14th hot rod test. However, von Braun was unable to convince NASA management to support the project. The use of nuclear weapons, by necessity, implied a certain degree of secrecy, whereas as a civilian agency, NASA was committed to complete transparency. So while the agency agreed to provide a small amount of funding for further studies, this was nowhere near enough to build a working Orion prototype. Ted Taylor and company thus had no choice but to turn to the US Air Force, who agreed to fund the project if a viable military application could be found. Desperate to keep the project alive, the Orion team dutifully concocted outlandish concepts for giant Orion-based space battleships that would fly in polar orbit, allowing them to bombard any point on the Earth's surface using nuclear warhead launchers. These concepts attracted the attention of General Thomas S. Parr, the head of the Air Force's Strategic Air Command, or SAC, who declared, "Whoever controls Orion controls the world." This enthusiasm, however, was short-lived. Given the limitations of early 1960s guidance technology, accurately hitting enemy targets from orbit would have been exceedingly challenging. Furthermore, both the US and the Soviet Union were developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, capable of placing multi-megaton warheads anywhere on Earth for far cheaper than an Orion-style orbiting platform, rendering the whole concept effectively worthless. Indeed, US Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was particularly unenthusiastic about Orion, while President John F. Kennedy, when shown a scale model of the Orion battleship in late 1963, reportedly recoiled in horror. The project was dealt another serious blow that same year when the United States, Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, banning the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. These factors convinced the Air Force to drop the project, forcing Ted Taylor to return once more to NASA and Werner von Braun. By this time, President Kennedy had announced the ambitious goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and von Braun was consumed by the development of the massive Saturn V rocket that would carry them there. Due to the limited test ban treaty, the Orion team decided to abandon their original ground launch concept and instead boost the prototype Orion into space atop a Saturn V booster, whereupon the nuclear pulse engine would take over. This required them to significantly scale down the vehicle to a diameter of only 10 meters and a mass of 90 tons. This, in turn, limited the craft's specific impulse to only 1800 to 2500 seconds. Very low by nuclear propulsion standards, but far beyond the capabilities of regular rocket engines. Furthermore, up to 45% of the spacecraft's mass would have been useful as payload, as compared to less than 5% for the Saturn V/Apollo combination, which was effectively a giant flying fuel tank. Indeed, so economical was Orion compared to the chemical rockets that the use of the Saturn V booster significantly diluted the system's inherent advantages, with Freeman Dyson estimating that the development of the Saturn V alone would constitute up to 50% of the project's total cost. Furthermore, it was soon determined that it was impossible to build a usable spacecraft that could be launched in a single piece. Up to 3 Saturn V launches would be needed, with the spacecraft components being assembled in orbit. Once assembled, the spacecraft would have allowed a crew of 8 to make a round trip to Mars in 125 days, as opposed to at least 18 months using conventional rockets. Yet despite these enormous advantages, NASA remained wary of the concept. In addition to the secrecy requirements, many worried about the risk of a nuclear pulse unit accidentally detonating or rupturing during liftoff, potentially contaminating a large area with plutonium and causing a public relations disaster. But the main argument against pursuing Orion was a simple lack of resources. Committed to meeting President Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade, NASA had abandoned big-picture approaches to space exploration like Orion and thrown all of its resources behind Project Apollo, which was expedient in the short term but had few long-term applications. Meanwhile, the Air Force became increasingly impatient with NASA's vacillating and pushed to end support for the project. In January 1965, Lieutenant Colonel John R. Burke of the U.S. Air Force Nuclear Power Division wrote that, quote, Practically every DoD/Air Force and NASA evaluation over the past 3 years, prior to 1965, has concluded that Iran provides the only capability for missions well beyond those achievable with chemical or nuclear rocket propulsion. The results point to a technique of rapidly traversing interplanetary distances substantially superior to any other method known today. However, although the Department of Defense supports the concept as being technically sound, without NASA support, the DoD and Air Force will not continue the program. All work on Iran technology will therefore cease in April 1965. In February, General Atomics halted all further research on Iran, limiting its remaining efforts to preparing a final report, while on June 30th, 1965, the Air Force finally terminated funding for the project. After 8 years and $11 million, Project Iran was dead. All future spaceflight programs would make use of chemical, not nuclear rockets. In his article, Death of a Project, research is stopped on a system of space propulsion which broke all the rules of the political game, published in the journal Science in July 1965, Freeman Dyson expressed his frustration with the enormous wasted potential of Iran, declaring that, quote, "This is the first time in modern history that a major expansion of human technology has been suppressed for political reasons." While today Project Iran might seem like a quaint and naive product of Cold War nuclear optimism, in the same vein as electricity too cheap to meter, and using atomic bombs to dig harbors and canals, the idea is not nearly as insane as it might first appear. As of this recording, Iran-style nuclear pulse propulsion is still our only feasible means of economically reaching Mars, the outer planets, or even another star, with Freeman Dyson once calculating that an interstellar Iran-type spacecraft could conceivably be propelled to velocities approaching 10% the speed of light, allowing it to reach Alpha Centauri, the closest star to our solar system, in as little as 44 years. Other alternative propulsion systems have been proposed, including laser light sails, solar sails, nuclear fusion and antimatter annihilation engines, and the Bassard ramjet, a giant scoop that gathers up and fuses hydrogen from the interstellar medium as it sails along, but none of these technologies are anywhere near developed enough for practical application. An Iran spacecraft, by contrast, can be built using 1950s technology. Indeed, it might even be our only hope of deflecting an incoming extinction-level comet or asteroid. As Daniel Durda, a senior research scientist at the Southwest Research Institute in Boulder, Colorado, developing such capability is of the utmost importance for humanity to survive in the long run. To quote him, "The worst scenario I can think of is a multi-kilometer diameter, long-period comet discovered several months out on an impact trajectory as it is entering the inner solar system. There is absolutely nothing we could do about it at this point in time. Nothing." And while detonating hundreds of nuclear warheads in the atmosphere in rapid succession might seem like a public health disaster waiting to happen, once again, the reality is rather more encouraging than you might think. Radioactive fallout from a nuclear detonation comes from two main sources: the vaporized remains of the bomb casing and dust, sand, soil, and other materials that are sucked up into the fireball and irradiated. Very little comes from the irradiation of the air itself. Thus, by launching an Iran-style spacecraft from a metal launch pad or barge, much of the latter source can be eliminated. Bomb casing materials can also be selected, or highly efficient nuclear warheads used to further reduce fallout. But even if regular dirty bombs are used, the overall risk to the global population is still remarkably small. Between 1945 and 1980, 5 nuclear nations, the US, Soviet Union, UK, France, and China, conducted a total of 528 above-ground nuclear tests, releasing large amounts of fallout into the atmosphere. According to a study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, of the 3.8 million Americans born in 1951 who would have been exposed to the highest fallout levels during their most vulnerable development years, only 1,000 would have suffered additional cancer deaths as a result, an increase of only 0.03%. By comparison, smoking would have killed some 250,000. Indeed, near the end of the project, Freeman Dyson calculated that each Iran launch would kill between 1 and 20 people, a minuscule 0.000000062% of the world population at the time. But even if Iran could be made 100% safe, there's still the sticky problem of the concept requiring thousands of complete, self-actuating nuclear warheads to function. While this, as famed astronomer and science communicator Carl Sagan once suggested, would be an ideal way to dispose of the world's military nuclear stockpiles, it would still create massive national security and nuclear proliferation problems. One solution is to use lasers or particle beams to fission pellets of nuclear fuel, an arrangement that cannot easily be turned into a weapon. A similar concept explored by the British Interplanetary Society's Project Daedalus in 1973 and NASA's Project Longshot in 1989 involves fusing deuterium and helium-3 fuel, which could potentially be mined from Jupiter's atmosphere and other places in the solar system. But until as a species we learn to stop worrying and love the bomb, our forays into the universe will continue to be but a small step instead of a giant leap.
Reach into your pocket and pull out your cell phone. Even if you're rocking the most ancient stripped-down flip phone from 2002, the object in your hands is still a marvel of modern electronics technology, packing billions of tiny switches into just a few cubic centimeters of space. By contrast, the Apollo guidance computer that sent humans to the moon contained only 17,000 switches, while the 3-story building-sized Sage computer used for North American aerospace defense in the 1950s contained 50,000. This tremendous feat of miniaturization was made possible by advances in integrated circuit manufacturing, in which entire computers composed of parts just a few billionths of a meter across are etched into the surface of tiny silicon chips. But these developments would never have happened if it were not for one key breakthrough made nearly 80 years ago, a discovery that forever changed the course of technology in the world. This is the story of the transistor, one of the single most important inventions in modern history. In the first half of the 20th century, electronics design was dominated by one key piece of technology, the vacuum tube. During Thomas Edison and his team's thousands of experiments trying to create an economically viable incandescent light bulb, there was a rather insanely revolutionary and far more unique device Edison accidentally invented in parallel with the light bulb that was just one of his light bulbs with a slight twist. But unfortunately for Edison, he didn't realize the implication of what he had just made in one of his thousands of tests, and how revolutionary it could be if it was refined a bit and put into the right applications. Because of his failure to realize any of this, nor be the one to perfect it for commercial use, despite his patent for the device, Edison is almost never given credit for his contribution on this world-changing invention. Which is unsurprising, as is a theme you're probably picking up on. It's the person who ultimately did the thing in its perfected commercial form, rather than who was first to come up with the thing that usually gets credit in popular history. On this one, enter English physicist John Ambrose Fleming, who was an advisor to Edison Electric Light. He would be inspired by Edison's device to create his revolutionary Fleming valve vacuum tube in the early 20th century. But going back to Edison's original device, at one point during his experiments on the light bulb, he and his staff were trying to figure out why carbon from the filament seemed to be jumping across the vacuum to the walls of the bulb. Clearly, some current flow was involved. So, in order to try and figure out what was going on here, Edison created a special bulb with a third electrode placed in between the legs of the filament, and then connected that to a galvanometer to measure the current. What he found was that if, relative to the filament, the plate was put at a negative potential, there would be no current between the plate and the filament. However, if the plate was at a positive potential, then the filament heated up enough and there would be a large current flow between the filament to the plate through the vacuum. Importantly in this, the electrons can only flow one way, from the hot element to the cold one, creating a rudimentary diode. Edison ultimately patented the device for its potential use as a sort of voltage regulator, but seemingly did not understand the implications beyond that. Importantly, he did show it off at the International Electrical Exposition in Philadelphia in 1884, with one William Preece bringing several of the bulbs back to England and coining the term Edison effect, also now known as thermionic emission, in a paper he published the following year on the phenomenon. And, of course, as noted, a couple of decades later, Fleming was inspired by all of this and ultimately did his thing, as did others like Lee De Forest in the United States, and the electronics age was born. Vacuum tubes came in two basic varieties, which allowed electricity to be controlled in particular ways. The diode, or thermionic valve, invented by Fleming in 1904, consisted of an evacuated glass bulb containing two basic components, a fine metal wire anode and a plate-shaped cathode. When current was run through the anode, as alluded to in the Edison test, the filament heated up red hot and began giving off electrons via a process called thermionic emission. These electrons were then caught by the cathode, allowing the current to pass through the diode. If, however, the current was reversed, the lack of a filament on the cathode prevented it from heating up and emitting electrons, meaning the current could not flow in that direction. Diodes thus functioned like one-way valves, hence their alternative name, and they were used as rectifiers for detecting radio signals, replacing the temperamental crystal detectors previously used in commercial radio sets. The triode, or Audion, invented by De Forest in 1906, was similar to the diode, but with an extra component, a metal grid between the anode and the cathode.
Applying an electric charge to the grid repelled electrons coming from the anode, allowing the number that made it through to the cathode to be adjusted. This meant that a weaker current could be used to control a stronger one, allowing weak signals like those from a radio receiver or telephone to be effectively amplified. De Forest's invention launched the modern era of electronics, making possible such breakthroughs as long-distance telephone and radio communications. Triodes were also widely used as electronic switches, being more reliable and less prone to wear than electromechanical relays. Indeed, the earliest electronic computers, like the British Colossus used to break the German Lorentz cipher, and the American ENIAC used to generate ballistic tables for naval guns, used thousands of networked vacuum tubes to perform high-speed calculations. However, vacuum tubes had a number of serious shortcomings. For one thing, their filaments needed to heat up in order to work, such that old electronic equipment like radios and television sets often took anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes to fully power up. They were also fragile, consumed large amounts of power, and generated large amounts of heat, meaning early electronic computers required massive air conditioning plants to keep their processors cool. And while sub-miniature vacuum tubes just a few centimeters long were developed, these power and heat issues placed a lower limit on the size of electronic circuits. For such devices to be made truly compact and portable, a new, more compact and energy-efficient type of electronic switch was needed. Ironically, the solution to this problem would ultimately be found in older technology. As mentioned at the start of today's video, early commercial radio sets used a device called a crystal detector to pick up radio signals. Also known as a cat's whisker detector, this device comprised a crystal of lead sulfide, or galena, and a small spring called the cat's whisker mounted on a pivoted handle. To use this type of radio, the user touched the cat's whisker to various parts of the galena crystal until they found a spot that rectified the radio signal and allowed it to be heard over headphones. As can be imagined, this device was finicky to use and took a great deal of practice to master. The crystal detector worked by forming a temporary metal semiconductor junction, also known as a Schottky diode, after its discoverer, German physicist Walter H. Schottky. Galena, along with iron pyrite, carborundum, silicon, germanium, and several other substances, belongs to a class of materials known as semiconductors. Neither excellent conductors like most metals nor full-blown electrical insulators, semiconductors can have their electrical properties modified by treating or doping them with various impurities such as arsenic or phosphorus. Such doping produces either an N-type semiconductor, which has an excess of electrons in the outer shells of its atoms, or a P-type semiconductor, which has an excess of missing electrons, known as electron holes. Sandwiching a P and N semiconductor together produced a P-N junction. At the interface between the two semiconductors, the difference in electrical charges causes a so-called diffusion current to flow, with electrons flowing from the N side to the P side, and electron holes floating from the P side to the N side. This in turn results in the formation of two adjacent layers of positive and negative change, known as the depletion region. When an external current is applied from the N to the P side, that is, in the direction of the internal diffusion current, it will flow freely through the diode. If, however, the current is applied in the opposite direction, it will cause the depletion region to grow, forming a barrier through which the current cannot flow. A PN junction thus performs the same function as a vacuum tube diode, allowing current to only flow in one direction. In a metal semiconductor junction, like a crystal detector, the semiconductor is N-type, while the metal acts as the P-type semiconductor, with the interface between the two forming a depletion region or Schottky barrier, like in a PN junction. The PN junction diode was discovered in 1939 by Bell Labs researcher Russell Ull when he accidentally cut a section of a silicon ingot across the PN junction and noted its rectifying qualities. During the Second World War, self-contained Schottky and PN diodes were developed for use in military radars, as vacuum tubes could not operate on the required frequencies. These devices were the first true solid-state miniaturized electronic components and pointed the way toward the use of semiconductors to create a new, efficient analog to the triode vacuum tube. Interestingly, a design for a type of semiconductor-based electronic switch, now known as a field effect transistor, or FET, was patented as early as 1925 by Austrian-American inventor Julius Lilienfeld. However, as sufficiently pure semiconductors were not available at the time, Lilienfeld was unable to construct a working prototype, and his design remained little more than a footnote in the history of electronics. It would not be until after the Second World War that his ideas would finally become a reality. The effort, which resulted in the development of the first practical transistor, was spearheaded by Mervyn Kelly, Director of Research at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey. Dissatisfied with the poor efficiency and reliability of vacuum tubes, in the late 1930s, Kelly assembled a solid-state physics research team to come up with a semiconductor-based alternative. This work was interrupted by the Second World War, but resumed soon after. Strangely, The project was of relatively low priority for Bell, for while the triode or Audion had originally been developed for long-distance telephony, by the late 1940s, the Bell telephone system was based not on vacuum tubes, but complex yet reliable electromechanical devices known as Strauger switches. A solid-state switch, if practical, was only anticipated to have limited, specialized applications such as military radio and radar equipment. Kelly assembled a diverse team of theoreticians, experimentalists, and engineers, including John Bardeen, Walter Britton, Robert Gibney, Burt Moore, John Pearson, and the aptly named William Shockley. Of these, it was the trio of Bardeen, Britton, under the supervision of Shockley, who would ultimately make the vital breakthrough. While the often difficult Shockley preferred to work alone at home, Britton and Bardeen formed a productive partnership, embracing the freewheeling, anything-goes research culture of Bell Labs by working unsupervised late into the night. The first design the team investigated was proposed by Shockley and worked similar to Julius Lilienfeld's 1925 concept. Built around a block of silicon, like a vacuum tube, the device had an anode and a cathode, now named the source and drain at either end, but instead of a grid, used a third electrode called a gate to control the flow of electricity through the device. In theory, when current was applied to the gate, the electric field generated would impede electrons from flowing between the source and the drain. In practice, however, the design failed to work. Nevertheless, Shockley was convinced his design was workable and pushed Bell Labs to file a patent with himself as sole inventor. To Shockley's dismay, however, Bell had recently unearthed Lilienfeld's original patents and informed Shockley that his idea wasn't actually original. After much experimentation, Walter Britton determined that the failure of Shockley's design was due to a buildup of electrons on the surface of the silicon blocking the gate's electric field. At the suggestion of Robert Gibney, he and Bardeen tried getting around this problem by dunking the prototype in distilled water, filling the air gap between the gate and the silicon, and enhancing the strength of the electric field. Incredibly, this actually worked, though nowhere near as efficiently as the team had hoped. As Shockley later noted, this new finding was electrifying. At long last, Britton and Gibney had overcome the blocking effect. Replacing the water with a chemical called glycol borate produced better results, but the device still had a slow response time and could not handle high frequencies, a key requirement for use in radio and radar equipment. Eventually, the team abandoned silicon as the substrate and focused instead on germanium, whose manufacture had already been perfected for use in diodes. But this material exhibited the same barrier effect as silicon, and though the team tried countless remedies like freezing the germanium with liquid nitrogen, full-scale amplification still continued to elude them. It was at this point that a pair of serendipitous accidents nudged the team in the right direction. For their newest prototype, Bratton grew a thin layer of oxide on the surface of the germanium crystal and deposited an even thinner layer of gold onto this, hoping that the oxide would insulate the gold from the germanium. At first, this seemed to work, but Bratton soon realized that the oxide layer had actually been washed away, meaning the gold was in direct contact with the germanium. This indicated that the device was not operating according to the field effect as Shockley had predicted, but some other still unknown phenomenon. On another occasion, while measuring the amplification or gain in a prototype, Britton accidentally shorted out and ruined one of the gate electrodes by touching it with the emitter electrode. But when he placed the emitter close to the gate electrode, he suddenly observed the gain the team had been searching for. Based on this, Bardeen suggested placing the emitter and gate electrodes extremely close to each other, within 50 micrometers, to enhance the effect. To accomplish this, Bratton wrapped a piece of thin gold foil around the point of a plastic triangle, cut a thin slit in the foil with a razor blade, and then forced this pair of closely spaced contacts into a crystal of germanium with a spring. Two electrodes, known as the emitter and collector, were connected to both halves of the gold foil, while a third base lead was connected to the germanium crystal, which had been specially prepared so that it consisted of two layers, an upper P layer full of electron holes and a lower N-type layer with excess electrons. In this configuration, the current flowing from the collector to the base was modulated by applying a current to the emitter. On December 16, 1947, Bratton and Bardeen tested their new design for the first time. To their delight, it worked perfectly, exhibiting a 30% gain in power and voltage, gain at 15% at a frequency of 1,000 Hz. Carpooling home that night, Bratton exclaimed to his colleagues that they had just conducted the most important experiment of their lives and swore them to secrecy until Bell Labs officially announced their discovery. Bardeen, however, couldn't help sharing the news, telling his wife at dinner that, "We discovered something today." His wife, distracted by the couple's children, reportedly replied, "That's nice, dear." By contrast, William Shockley, on sabbatical in Europe at the time, was enraged to discover that not only had he been not directly involved in the team's breakthrough, but that they had strayed so far from his original field effect concept. It was a bitterness which would prove surprisingly productive. On June 30th, 1948, Bell Labs officially announced Brattain and Bardine's discovery, which by now had acquired a new name, the transistor. The term had been coined by fellow Bell engineer and part-time science fiction writer John Pierce as a contraction of transresistor. Unfortunately, however, the announcement of the transistor received little attention in either the popular or scientific press. Not only were there few apparent applications for the device, but it was fragile, temperamental, and difficult to manufacture. Furthermore, even its inventors didn't understand exactly how it worked. Meanwhile, Shockley, fueled by jealousy and indignation, doggedly pursued his quest to one-up his colleagues. While attending a meeting of the Physical Society in Chicago in late 1947, he began filling his notebook with page after page of detailed notes describing a new type of transistor consisting of one layer of p-type semiconductor sandwiched between two layers of n-type semiconductor. By January 23rd, 1948, Shockley had come up with a workable design which worked similarly to a PN diode but with three terminals: the emitter, the collector, and the base. When a positive current was applied to the base, it disrupted the depletion region between the semiconductor layers by draining away excess electrons, allowing current to flow between the emitter and the collector. Bardeen and Brattain's transistor worked in a similar fashion, only the currents traveled through a thin layer at the top of the germanium crystal. 1 month after Shockley perfected his theoretical design, Bell Labs filed 4 patents for semiconductor amplifiers, both Brattain and Bardeen's original point-contact design and Shockley's bipolar junction or NPN transistor. Though Shockley's design was successfully demonstrated on April 2nd, 1950, the first commercial transistors, produced by Western Electric in 1951, were of the point-contact type. But while these saw limited use in long-term telephone switching gear and military equipment, it soon became clear that the junction transistor was far more robust and easy to manufacture, and this became the standard design going forward. Still, for several years, the transistor remained a solution looking for a problem. It was not until 1952 that New York-based firm Sonotone introduced the lightweight transistorized hearing aid, the first consumer product to make use of the new technology. 2 years later, researcher Gordon Teal at Texas Instruments figured out how to replace germanium, which was unreliable and sensitive to heat fluctuations, with silicon, producing an even more reliable and robust transistor. That same year, Texas Instruments and Industrial Development Engineering Associates unveiled a groundbreaking product, the Regency T1, the world's first portable, fully transistorized radio. Though plagued by technical problems, the radio was an instant hit, selling over 150,000 units over its brief production run. It is difficult to overstate the cultural impact of the TR1 and its descendants. Previously, consumer radios were heavy, bulky devices restricted to the home living room. With transistor radios, however, consumers, particularly teenagers, could take their music wherever they wanted, an ability that profoundly shaped the development of youth culture. The transistor also helped reshape the global economic landscape. As American manufacturers began increasingly focusing on Cold War military contracts, foreign entrepreneurs saw an opportunity to cash in on the emerging consumer electronics market. Among these were Japanese engineers Masaru Ibuka and Akio Morita, who in 1946 founded an electronics company called Tokyo Teletech. In 1958, the company changed its name to Sony. Soon, inexpensive Sony transistor radios and television sets began flooding the global market, establishing Japan as a global leader in consumer electronics and finally bringing the era of the vacuum tube to an end. Meanwhile, the importance of Brattain, Bardeen, and Shockley's discoveries were finally recognized when, in 1956, the trio shared the Nobel Prize in Physics for their researches on semiconductors and their discovery of the transistor effect. But their elation was short-lived, for by then, Shockley's ruthless pursuit of sole credit for the invention of the transistor had broken the team apart. Shortly after receiving the Nobel Prize, Shockley moved to Palo Alto, California, and founded Shockley Semiconductor Laboratory, the first tech company in what would come to be known as Silicon Valley. But while Shockley's clout initially attracted the best and brightest to his company, his difficult personality and tyrannical management style soon drove them away. One group of exiles, known as the Traitorous Eight, went on to found Fairchild Semiconductor, which in 1959 developed the world's first practical integrated circuit or microchip. 2 of the 8, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore, later founded the Intel Corporation, today one of the world's largest manufacturers of microprocessors. After losing his company in 1963, Shockley accepted a position at Stanford University as a professor of engineering and applied science. And it is here that his career took a dark turn. Despite holding no degree in genetics or related disciplines, Shockley began vocally promoting pseudoscientific theories about race, intelligence, and eugenics, declaring, for example, that my research leads me inescapably to the opinion that the major cause of the American Negro's intellectual and social deficits is hereditary and racially genetic in origin, and thus not remediable to a major degree by practical improvements in the environment. Such was Shockley's conviction that miscegenation, aka race mixing, posed an existential threat to the US that he ran as a Republican candidate in the 1982 Senate election on the single-issue platform of opposing the, quote, dysgenic threat posed by African Americans and other minority groups. He came in 8th place in the primary, receiving a paltry 0.37% of the vote. By the time Shockley died in 1989 at the age of 79, he had become a pariah, with his obituary in the Los Angeles Times stating he went from being a physicist with impeccable academic credentials to amateur geneticist, becoming a lightning rod whose views sparked campus demonstrations and a cascade of calumny. Meanwhile, the co-discoverers of the transistor fared somewhat better. In 1951, John Bardeen left Bell Labs for the University of Illinois, where he began investigating the phenomenon of superconductivity, the ability of certain metals to attain zero electrical resistance when cooled to extremely low temperatures. This pioneering work earned him the 1972 Nobel Prize in Physics, making him the only person in history to win this award twice. He died in 1991 at the age of 82. Walter Bretton continued to work at Bell Labs until 1967 before joining the faculty at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, where he remained until his retirement in 1976. He died in 1987 at the age of 85. Thus, while the transistor launched a multi-billion-dollar global industry, beyond their Nobel Prizes, none of the three inventors significantly benefited financially from their discovery. In any piece discussing the origins of the transistor, though, we'd be remiss in not pointing out that Bardeen, Bratton, and Shockley were not the sole people working on the transistor when they came up with it. At the same time as semiconductor research was ramping up at Bell Labs, Herbert Matare and Heinrich Welke, German physicists working at the Compagnie de France et Signo in Paris, were investigating similar germanium-based modulation devices. In June 1948, they succeeded in building a working point-contact transistor remarkably similar to Bardeen, Bretton, and Shockley's 1947 prototype. Shortly thereafter, however, Matar and Welke were dismayed to learn that Bell Labs had already beaten them to the punch. Nevertheless, in 1949, their employer became the first company in Europe to commercially produce transistors. It should also be mentioned that less than a decade later, a number of the inventors, including Ian Ross, John Walmark, and Mohammed Atala, developed workable field effect transistors, or FETs. Today, FETs, in particular metal oxide or MOSFETs, are the most widely used transistor type in the world, being particularly well suited to miniaturization. Indeed, while the earliest commercial transistors were on the order of 1 centimeter in size, modern integrated circuit transistors are so inconceivably tiny that the world's most powerful single computer chip at the time of writing of this piece, the Cerebrus Wafer Scale Engine 2, contains an unfathomable 2.6 trillion, with a T, of them.
100 kilometers northeast of Sudbury in the Canadian province of Ontario lies the small town of Cobalt, population around only 1,000 people. There isn't much left today. Like many former mining towns scattered across the province, Cobalt went boom and bust long ago, leaving it a shell of its former self. But in its heyday, Cobalt was a powerhouse, source of a significant percentage of the world's silver and the birthplace of hard rock mining in Canada. But the town had another, less well-known claim to fame, located some 16 kilometers southeast on the banks of the Montreal River. Until the 1980s, a spectacular white rooster tail of water shot up from the banks of the Montreal River, sending a curtain of mist drifting across the surrounding woodlands. This man-made geyser marked the site of an engineering marvel, the Ragged Chute compressed air plant, which despite having no moving parts, reliably supplied power to the surrounding mines for more than a century. This is the story of one of the most ingenious, elegant engineering projects in history and the forgotten engineer who created it. Silver was discovered in the Cobalt area in 1903, causing a booming mining industry to spring up almost overnight. The silver ore, conveniently located close to the surface, contained a large proportion of cobalt metal, which gave the town its name. Incorporated in 1906, by 1909, Cobalt's population had soared to more than 10,000 people, and by 1911, 1911, it was the 4th largest silver producer in the world, the 34 surrounding mines producing 30 million ounces of silver per year, nearly 9% of the global supply. At first, excavation was done largely by hand, but as the shafts and drifts extended ever further into the ground, the need grew for increased mechanization. At first, a coal-fired plant was constructed to generate electricity and compressed air for lights, hoists, rock drills, and other equipment, but this soon proved exorbitantly expensive to operate. The plant consumed some 100,000 tons of coal per year, which at the contemporary rate of $5.50 a ton meant that one drill operating 18 hours per day could cost up to $250 a month, far more than a typical miner's salary at the time. Thankfully, a more economical source of power was close at hand, the Montreal River, which featured numerous rapids ideal for generating hydroelectricity. In 1906, brothers C.A. and B.C. Bede formed the Cobalt Power Company Limited and obtained a lease to build a hydroelectric dam at Chute Falls, approximately 10 kilometers from Cobalt. Due to uncertainties regarding the stability of the silver market, the project was delayed several years, construction finally beginning in 1908 and the plant opening in 1910 with a generating capacity of 3.5 megawatts or 4,600 horsepower. Another generating unit was added in 1911, increasing its capacity to 9.5 megawatts or 12,700 horsepower. Though the plant still operates to this day, soon after its completion, it was supplanted in its intended role by a far more elegant and ingenious piece of engineering, the Ragged Chute compressed air plant, designed by brilliant Canadian engineer Charles Taylor. Born in Chatham, New Brunswick on January the 20th, 1859, Charles Havelock Taylor was the 8th child and first son born to Charles Taylor Sr., a construction engineer, and his wife Mary. Fast forward to 1876, and the Taylor family moved to Montreal, where the elder Charles's company had been awarded a contract to build a section of the Lachine Canal. Soon afterward, the young Charles Jr. began work as a mining claim investigator for his uncle, who owned the Howard Watch Company of New York City. Over the following decade, Taylor traveled to sites all across the continent, becoming a highly competent, self-taught mining expert, prospector, and mechanical engineer. He applied these skills to a whole host of endeavors, developing a gold mine in Madoc, Ontario, and a steam laundry and ice skate factory in Montreal. Then, in 1895, while working on the Buckingham Dam near Ottawa, he noticed an unusual phenomenon. During the winter, water flowing over the dam's spillway carried air bubbles under the frozen surface of the river, which rose and collected to form large ice domes. When Taylor drilled into one of these domes, to his surprise, the trapped air rushed out under high pressure. Taylor reasoned that the air was being compressed by the weight of the water column as it was carried beneath the surface, and realized that if water was diverted down a long vertical shaft, this process could be harnessed to generate a reliable source of compressed air. Using scale models, he began tinkering with variations in shaft depth and diameter to achieve optimum performance. Unknown to Taylor, he had independently reinvented a much older device known as a trompe. Invented in Italy in the 17th century and named after the French word for trunk, trompes were most extensively used by ironworkers in Catalina, Spain, to continuously supply air to their bloomeries or smelting furnaces. In this design, water in an elevated trough or head race flowed down a vertical pipe or downcomer. This was fitted with a restriction, or venturi, which created a suction that drew in air bubbles through a series of inlet holes. The column of water carried the bubbles down to a container called a wind box, where it impacted a platform or bench. The water then drained out the bottom of the wind box, while the now compressed air was drawn out the top into a blast pipe and used to stoke the furnace. Much later, engineers attempted to significantly increase the size and power of trompes. For example, in 1877, one J.P. Frizzle constructed a 1.5 meter or 5 foot tall example on the Mississippi River at the St. Anthony Falls near St. Paul, Minnesota. But while Taylor did not originate the idea, he nonetheless went on to implement the trompe principle on a far larger scale than had ever been attempted before. Taylor's first large-scale compressed air plant was built at Magog, Quebec, 100 kilometers east of Montreal, to power the Dominion Cotton Mills Company's printing works. The factory had previously experimented with various combinations of steam, electric, and compressed air power to operate its printing presses, but none proved satisfactory. Taylor's 115 kilowatt or 150 horsepower hydraulic plant, which produced compressed air at 358 kilopascals or 51 pounds per square inch, first opened on August the 12th, 1896, and was an immediate success, operating almost continuously until 1953. In 1898, Taylor formed the Kootenai Air Supply Company and built a 450 kilowatt or 600 horsepower compressor at Ainsworth, British Columbia to supply the Caslow Mining Company's planned copper mine. However, the Great Northern Railroad did not build its promised spur line to the site, and the mine never opened, setting Taylor back some $60,000, around $2.3 million in today's money. But Taylor's greatest success would be at the Ragged Chute, 7 kilometers downstream of the Hound Chute hydroelectric dam on the Montreal River, which he first visited in 1905. Taylor promised local mine owners a plant which could provide a continuous supply of 862 kilopascal or 125 psi air and require almost no maintenance or manpower to operate. As you might imagine, many dismissed his proposal as impossible, with one mine owner describing Taylor as a crazy 2-bit so-called engineer, self-taught, a little better than a mechanic with a bunch of wacky ideas. In any event, despite some initial pushback, Taylor managed to secure the needed funds and construction was completed in 1910. The Ragged Chute compressed air plant was a marvel of simplicity and rugged engineering. A 200 meter or 650 foot wide, 20 meter or 65 foot high dam diverting water into a set of intake heads, the height of which could be adjusted to maintain a constant hydraulic head, a measure of a fluid's potential energy, of around 46 centimeters or 18 inches. Through the intake heads, the water flowed through a restriction into a vertical shaft 106 meters or 350 feet deep and 3 meters or 10 feet in diameter. This restriction lowered the water's pressure via the Venturi effect, sucking down inlet pipes and entraining the bubbles in the falling water column. As the bubbles were swept downwards, the air was compressed to a degree proportional to the height or head of the hydraulic column. Efficient operation required the shaft to be as smooth and perfectly cylindrical as possible, so Taylor designed a special circular drilling platform for the excavators and patched any irregularities in the stone walls using concrete. At the bottom of the shaft, the water column struck a concrete cone sheathed in steel, which separated the now compressed air from the water. The air then flowed along the roof of a 311 meter or 1,000 foot long horizontal tunnel until it reached an inclined plenum or collection shaft. From here, the air was carried via a 60 centimeter or 23 inch diameter shaft to a valve house and then along a 52 centimeter or 20 inch outlet pipeline for distribution to the various mines in the area. Meanwhile, the water was returned to the river through a 90 meter or 295 foot high tail shaft. In the event production capacity exceeded demand, Taylor designed the plant with an automatic pressure relief system. A blowout pipe extended into the horizontal tunnel down to a critical water level such that when the air pressure caused the water to drop below this level, the excess air was vented to the surface, creating a spectacular 60 meter or 196 foot high geyser that soon became a major tourist attraction in the area. Having no real moving parts, the Ragged Chute plant required essentially no maintenance or intervention to operate except to occasionally adjust the height of the feed heads and consequently cost almost nothing to operate. Furthermore, the plant operated at an astounding 82% efficiency and generated compressed air that was far cleaner and drier than from a mechanical compressor. This was because the temperature of the river water was below the dew point of the air, causing nearly all the moisture to condense out before the air reached the outlet pipe. Dry air is essential to the operation of pneumatic tools because moisture can freeze inside the tools and otherwise cause corrosion and wash away vital lubricants. Since its completion in 1910, Ragged Chute operated almost continuously for 70 years, only being briefly shut down in 1950 and 1961 for maintenance on the intake pipes. However, by then, the fortunes of the town the plant was built to serve had long since declined. By the 1930s, the silver reserves around cobalt were largely depleted and mine after mine began to close, the town steadily dwindling to its current population of less than 1,000 people. The last mine in the area, Agnico Eagle, closed in the 1980s, having produced over 420 million ounces of silver. The Ragged Chute facility was acquired by Ontario Hydro in 1945 and continued to operate until the valve house burned down and the plant was officially closed down on December the 24th, 1981. In 1991, the defunct plant was purchased by Canadian hydro developers, today TransAlta, and a conventional hydroelectric dam built on the site. Yet the legacy of Ragged Chute lives on. In 2019, the Canadian federal government announced plans to construct an updated version of Taylor's hydraulic compressor to supply compressed air to the Holloway gold mine in northern Ontario. The compressor, designed by Sudbury-based company Electrical Innovation, promises to reduce the mine's energy consumption by 40%, vindicating the efficiency and utility of this nearly 400-year-old technology. And as an aside, in the 1930s, the Tennessee Valley Authority attempted to build a 35-megawatt or 47,000 horsepower compressed air plant based on Taylor's design. However, one of the designers misread a critical measurement by a single digit, which caused the plant's efficiency to plummet from 82% to only 10%, a testament to the astounding exactness of Taylor's calculations. Cobalt-2 may soon get a reprieve from its ghost town status thanks to its namesake's metal. At the time of the town's founding, cobalt was considered a nuisance byproduct with relatively few industrial uses outside of pigments for coloring glass, ceramics, and paints. Today, however, the metal is a vital component in the lithium-ion batteries that power many electronic devices and electric cars, while the radioisotope cobalt-60 is widely used in the treatment of cancer. Traditionally, 60% of the world's cobalt has come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, a politically unstable region where the ore is often mined using child labor in deplorable working conditions. This has caused the commodity price of cobalt to rise by 300% since 2015 to over $30 an ounce, and battery manufacturers to seek out more reliable, affordable, and ethical sources for the metal, including Southwest Ontario. Indeed, in recent years, companies like First Cobalt Corporations have begun prospecting mineral deposits in the cobalt area, meaning the forgotten birthplace of Canadian hard rock mining may become a boom town once again. But whether its mines will be powered by an elegant Taylor-type compressed air plant, only time will tell.